Dear colleagues, members of the European Parliament, Serbian government representatives, EU Council, EU delegation in Serbia, Your Excellencies, members of the Diplomatic Corps, EU member states, MPs of Serbia, and other participants. It is a pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the National Assembly of Serbia, on behalf of my colleagues, the deputies, and personally here in the House of the National Assembly to our 11th SAA Joint Committee meeting. We are especially honored to have with us the Minister for European Integrations, Mrs. Joksimovic, His Excellency Kimo Lang-de-Werden, Ambassadeur plénipotentiaire extraordinaire of Europe in Serbia, Finland, and Madam Matea Norčić-Tancer, Deputy Head of Mission of the European delegation here in Serbia. We have the new composition of our committee. We have new European members, so we congratulate Mrs. Fajon and other members of the European delegation for their new mandates in European Parliament, and I'm convinced that we are going to preserve the spirit of good cooperation jointly and work towards our joint goal, which is Serbian European membership. In the hope of continuing to achieve good results, I will tell you that we have agreed the comprehensive text of our joint delegations and recommendations. So I ask the members of both delegations to look into the text in detail. As Mr. Bilčík, the new rapporteur, pointed out, this is an important period for the enlargement and also for the future of Serbia, Serbia being an important partner in the Western Balkans. It is a time which makes it mandatory, important for us to work jointly, to put more effort, and we have to work jointly in order to achieve this success, to arrive at this success. We can hear different messages from Europe regarding the enlargement. For us, this is no excuse not to continue the reforms in Serbia. The reforms will move ahead on sort of higher speed. We are going to intensify the reform processes because only this would mark the progress. If we stall, if we stop, it would mean for Serbia to lag behind, to stay where it is, which is unacceptable for us. Our strategic goal is European membership, and we will do everything in our power to arrive there as quickly, as soon as possible, based on merits, of course, based on achievements. We ask for no special excuses or special treatment, but just for a certainty that when we meet our criteria, the goal will be there. It is important for us to do our part of the job, but it is also important for our public to overcome this European dilemma regarding the enlargement and to have clear messages coming from Europe. Also to neutralize the polarities in Europe when it comes to European reforms. Enlargement do not exclude internal European reforms. These two processes can go on parallel tracks at the same time, as they did a few times before in history. We hope that Finnish presidency would contribute to the additional building of solidarity and unity in the Union, which is one of the priorities of the presidency, and that the enlargement policy will become more concrete in the days ahead of us. We hope that at the next governmental conference, several chapters which are ready for opening will be opened. We have prepared several chapters and are waiting for the green light. Dear members, we are all going to offer our members from the European delegation will present their view of the current progress in our European delegation negotiation process, and we will look into the ways how to intensify the process of integration into the European Union on behalf of Serbia. Every member of the Joint Committee meets our expectations. we always open important issues which help us to look at different issues from different perspectives, to clarify things, to make yet another step towards Europe on our European way. Before we start with the first item on our agenda, I would pass the floor to my co-chair, Mrs. Fajon, to greet you on behalf of the European Parliament. Thank you, dear co-chair, Mr. Orlic, dear colleagues, Minister, dear media representatives. Just a few words, first in Serbian, to thank you all for the welcome that we all received here, and to say that today, tomorrow, we will have the 11th meeting of our SAPS committee, and I hope to see a successful and sincere dialogue which would further Serbian European integration processes. I apologize, we are a smaller delegation today, only 4 of us have come to Belgrade, but after the elections we have to deal with several restrictions in the Parliament on our traveling expenses, so we made very late the decision to come to Belgrade, but we have both main political groups, 4 colleagues came together to Belgrade and all of us support Serbia fully on its European integration road. Now I will switch to English because it's slightly easier for me.
I would like to stress that our meeting today and tomorrow is particularly very timely. As you mentioned yourself, we are coming with a new delegation following the European Parliamentary elections in May, and our members are eager to continue our joint parliamentary work. The European Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee is preparing for the next annual Serbia report, resolution. You mentioned also that we just appointed a new rapporteur coming from EPP group, a dear colleague of ours, Vladimir Bilčík, on the basis of May Commission country report. And the first round of EP facilitated inter-party dialogue in the Serbian National Assembly, as you all know, took place in the mid of October. There are further rounds scheduled, the next one for mid of November. It's no secret that I will participate in the dialogue itself also. And after the European Parliament and the Council both adopted their positions in the beginning of the year, we are now entering interinstitutional negotiations for IPA 3. This is the pre-accession assistance for the next financial period between 2021 and 2027, to be rounded up by the end of 2020. As you all know, the Commission is currently preparing the non-paper on rule of law to be presented to the Council during the second half of November. And last but not least, because Serbia is preparing for parliamentary, provincial and local elections spring next year, that is also why we wanted to go ahead with this joint meeting today and tomorrow, as it will be the last one in Serbia's current legislature. So I would like to point to the fact that the European Parliament continues to actively support the EU enlargement policy and advocate Serbia's accession to the European Union as the best way for the country's development and prosperity. And I firmly believe that the EU should not be distracted from opening its doors to the Western Balkans, despite being faced with Brexit, the migration challenge, raising populism, instability in the neighbourhood, and efforts to compose a new European Commission that will start its work most likely at the beginning of December. As you certainly are all aware, it was unfortunately not a moment of glory earlier this month at the meeting of foreign ministers in Luxembourg and heads of states and governments of EU member states in Brussels, who failed despite 2 consecutive recommendations in 2018 and 2019 by the European Commission and the unconditional support of the European Parliament to launch accession negotiations with North Serbia and Albania. So we realized that this was a very missed opportunity and a strategic mistake. that may irreversibly affect our credibility in the region, and even more importantly, it may have serious and long-lasting consequences for our own stability and security. The European Parliament therefore adopted last week in Strasbourg a resolution during the plenary with strong support in favour, 412 votes in favour, 136 against and 30 abstentions, to send a very strong signal in support of the opening of the negotiations and put pressure on EU countries to take a positive, unanimous decision at their next meeting. And dear friends, I do believe that we have to honour our joint commitments. The time to act geopolitically is now. We expect the European Council to revert to the issue of enlargement and give a positive signal to Albania and North Macedonia already before the next EU Western Balkans Summit in Zagreb, May next year. If the EU fails to offer the Western Balkans a political perspective, the whole region will become unstable and be more exposed to destabilizing influence by Russia, Turkey, and other powers with low or no democratic standards, such as China or Saudi Arabia. This would, as a consequence, weaken us, the European Union, too. And in some regards, the EU could take some lessons from the old Habsburgs. The Habsburg Empire survived for centuries. In the glory days, it stretched all the way from Spain and the Netherlands to Croatia and Galicia in Ukraine. How was it possible that a large, divided and complex state comprising German speakers, Hungarians, Slavs, Italians and others plagued by financial difficulties managed to stay intact for so long while being challenged by rivals on all sides? So the answer is that the Habsburgs' key foreign policy goal was to invest in diplomacy and neighbouring relations, and this is what we all try to achieve today. The emperor formed alliances with nations, large and small, beyond the borders. And these allies formed a buffer zone, and the Habsburg army, being small, they could be called on for help when needed. As a result, the empire lost many battles, but it rarely lost a war. So the EU is facing similar challenges like the Habsburgs. It must work out ways to navigate an increasingly challenging geopolitical map and stand firm without the advantage of military predominance. One lesson is to invest more in the European neighbourhood. Another is to prevent Europe's buffer zone from becoming a frying edge. It is in our best interest that the countries in the Western Balkans are offered a European perspective, so outside powers cannot use them to destabilize us. Promisingly, the Western Balkans and the Eastern EU borders will be the main foreign policy priorities for incoming EU Foreign Policy Chief, Josep Borrell, as he confirmed it during his hearing in the European Parliament. If we, I quote, as Europeans can't solve a problem in the immediate vicinity, then we can't be a world power, he said. This is the right choice. It was, after all, careless maneuvering in the Balkans that provided or that proved fatal for the Habsburg Empire. The EU should continue to expand in the Western Balkans and contribute to peace, reconciliation and prosperity in the region. And with these words, and without further ado, I wish both delegations a very successful work.
Thank you, Mrs. Fajon. We can start with our first joint working session. We have to adopt the agenda, dear colleagues. We have the agenda circulated to all committee members by the secretariats. Do the delegations agree to the agenda? Do we have any amendments to the agenda? If there are no amendments, we can adopt it unanimously. Yes? Thank you. Just an information. The minutes from the previous 10th meeting was adopted in a written exchange, so minutes are adopted. Next point. Current situation in accession negotiations. We have Serbian government representatives. and representatives of the European Foreign Service and European Presidency. We have our keynote speakers, and we will hear from members of both delegations. On behalf of the Serbian government, first keynote speaker, the Minister for European Integrations, Minister Mrs. Jadranka Joksimovic. Thank you, dear deputies, dear members of the European Parliament, dear Ambassador de Wert, all other excellency present, Mrs. Norčić-Stancer, and of course our chairs, Mrs. Fajon and Mr. Orlic. Just to correct Mrs. Orlic, we are not in the pre-accession negotiations, we are in the accession negotiations to the European Union, which is a huge difference, and it tells us a lot. We hear many unofficial informations that circulate around, and we started dealing with these unofficial informations. We get busy analyzing unofficial informations, how the accession process would continue, pre-accession process would happen, are the privileged partnerships an exchange for European membership, and we are not dealing with facts. And the facts are the accession process of Serbia, defined by clear contractual obligations by both sides. SAA on one hand side, candidateship gained by Serbia, and the official opening of accession negotiations. Why North Macedonia and Albania were dissatisfied? Because they didn't enter accession process. We are not in the pre-accession process. We are negotiating our membership. We are in the membership negotiations. As the enlargement strategy for Western Balkans in February 2018 foresaw, the then European Commissioner, the President of the Commission, Juncker, brought the paper to Serbia in this credible strategy, enlargement strategy for Western Balkans. We heard clearly that Serbia and Montenegro are the leaders in this process, and certain perspectives were given. Dates, not even us in Serbia were over-enthusiastic about the dates Juncker mentioned, but we said it is good for us to have a framework, be it 2025 or 2027. The precise dates are not at issue, but clear perspective was there, and we were really pleased, content with the way that the then European Commission dealt with the accession and membership process. This strategy is the legacy to the new Commission and the new President of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, to put in effect, to work with it, to apply it. And we expect the continuation of the European enlargement policy, and we hope that the new Commission, the new composition of the Commission, as Mrs. von der Leyen, when she addressed the Parliament, said for the first time, there is no unified whole Europe of solidarity, peaceful Europe, without Western Balkans inside the European Union. All other stories which are unofficial, which media circulate, and which make us react to them. And we are now in a bizarre situation reacting to something which is not official, which does not exist. We disturb the public. There are all sorts of suspicions, miscomprehensions, interpretations which are useful. I don't know to whom, who can benefit from this. So I call to all of you, all MEPs, regardless of the caucuses of the groups, because they contribute to the creation of the public opinion in Europe, I would call on all of us to stick to the facts, which is the membership negotiations as they are now. And Serbia, very patiently and competently, I would also add, is monitoring everything which is emerging as new realities, or new proposals with this new enlargement optics. When we talk about Serbia, I will say that it is very important for us for the continuation of the admission negotiations carries on with a certain dynamics.
Da je ne usporimo još više. Dakle, ona ni sada nije brza i ja verujem da jednom tom ustaljenom dinamikom Srbija do kraja godine, tokom finskog predsjedavanja, ima sasvim realne osnove.
We don't want to slow it further down. Serbia needs to open up the new chapters that have been technically prepared. At the moment, 4 have been prepared. Chapters 2, relating to the freedom of movement of workers. Chapter 4, freedom of movement of capital. Chapter 14, transport policy. And Chapter 21, trans-European networks. These are very important chapters. We prepared them, some of them a long time ago, but we are working hard on other chapters. Let me just mention that we are working to prepare for Chapter 28, protection of consumers and health, then 27, environmental protection, and the freedom of providing services, that is Chapter number 3, and companies. What is very important in my view, and has already been mentioned, is that the European Commission will prepare a non-paper that should be presented to the member states in the course of next month, relating to the progress of Serbia in the implementation of action plans for chapters 23 and 24. What is the rule of law, fight against corruption, freedom of the media, rights of national minorities, fight against organized crime, reform of the judiciary, and a whole series of other fields. We are going to open the screenings on them later on. There are a sufficient number of arguments for the member states, considering the series of activities undertaken by Serbia in these undefined and troubled turmoils when it comes to the continuation of the enlargement policy. We did not wait. Even though we are patient enough, we will wait for the agreement to be reached within the member states of the EU as to what is the future of the enlargement policy. But we will not stand still in our reform process. We often hear that this is going to cause some frustrations. There are rumors according to which Serbia is already frustrated and that we have now turned to the Russian Federation, to some other stakeholders, to the People's Republic of China, Turkey, etc. No, Serbia is not frustrated. Serbia is highly motivated to do everything we can to the best of our ability for our citizens, to do everything that is beneficial and brings welfare to a concept which is important for the EU, and that is the economy of welfare. That is what we are committed to, and that is why we are doing our best in this stage of negotiations to open the doors. Of course, we are not neglecting the strategic goal, which is not a privileged partnership with the EU, but rather full membership of Serbia in the EU. This is important to be highlighted. Of course, we do have understanding for various ideas and needs of the EU. I believe that it is like a cathartic for the EU to admit that there are some institutional needs to change the policy, the concepts underlying the common policies of the EU. We do understand that. We are not frustrated. We are very patient, but our goal is full-fledged membership, and from the very beginning that was the guiding motive for all the steps undertaken by Serbia in the EU integration process and in the European integration, generally speaking. I think this applies not only to Serbia, but to other countries of the region. We have defined their goals in the same way. I would also like to point out, very often we hear, is Serbia sincerely committed to the European path? What we are doing now, is that rooted in the strategic goal of full-fledged membership? Yes, Serbia has proven that it is a reliable partner who does not change its policy overnight, even though if the circumstances are not favorable for the enlargement, but we can equally ask whether the EU is a reliable partner. If during the process underlying criteria, is it the reliable partner when it comes to the sincerity of the enlargement policy? It is very important that last night President Vučić, whom you will the opportunity to meet yesterday, you MEPs, last night in Brussels, there were talks with the outgoing administration and officials, but important messages were sent. It is very important to have a very open partnership and constructive dialogue. It is very important that our president reiterated in his statement, yes, we do understand everything. We do not have a problem with the revision of the methodology or the process, but our strategic goal is full membership of Serbia in the European Union. As for the revision of the methodology, another matter that I need to highlight, and at another conference today I mentioned it as well. It is important for our citizens and for all of us together to be reminded that Serbia is the country to which the methodology of accession negotiations was applied for the first time. Namely, Serbia was the first country that had to open chapters 22 and 23 as suspensive chapters, plus chapter 35, which is monitoring of implementation of the Brussels Agreement. So let us remind ourselves, none of the states that relatively recently became EU members, and not even the EU who is a candidate and opened even more chapters than Serbia, has not yet started applying this new methodology. So this rigid and strict methodology was applied for Serbia for the first time. Namely, these most demanding chapters had to be open in the very early stage of negotiations, and they will be closed the last. The methodology according to which we negotiate requires that if there is no progress made, or if there is lagging behind or going backward, negotiations on other chapters can be temporarily discontinued, which is a very strict methodology that already exists. So Serbia has already survived one important revision, and we are continuing with the negotiations. Within the European institutions, the debates are underway. I would like to point your attention once again that the European integrations process still has its positive transforming impact on all of us in the region. But this is not only a matter of the region. I wonder, how can somebody give up of what the EU has as the only global actor? And that is the possibility of integration and of transposition of the highest values and standards that still make the EU the best place to live. So I wonder, why are there still discussions underway as to whether the European Union wants to give up this advantage and this power that it has compared to everybody else? With others, you can have privileged partnerships, contractual or treaty relations or trade relations, but there is never, nobody has such a model as the EU does. So this is an important issue for us as candidate countries, but also for the EU. No doubt Serbia remains committed to this path. There is a song that we have which says, "Count on us." So you can count on Serbia as a serious country that will not change its policy, but we do expect the EU to define its own interests, and we shall be patient in that, because we want to make our country better for our citizens, and then we would like the European Union to continue with its enlargement to the Balkan area and to become an even stronger factor and to improve its soft power in the global framework. I believe that the Western Balkans and Serbia, as a responsible country, are advocating the benefits of everybody else in the region. We all need to move forward. All responsible governments really have to work for the benefit of the better lives of all of our citizens. Thank you. Thank you. I give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Kim Valdewift, to address us on behalf of the Presidency.
Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Presidency of the EU, it's my pleasure to address you today on the occasion of the 11th meeting of the EU-Serbia Stabilisation and Association Parliamentary Committee. I believe that the role of this forum is very important for advancing in Serbia's path towards EU membership, as it focuses on areas fundamental to the future EU accession, such as functioning of democratic institutions, improving electoral environment, and enhancing inter-party dialogue. This work is particularly valuable in the context of the upcoming parliamentary elections in Serbia next spring. For our presidency, together with our trio partners, Romania and Croatia, advancing EU enlargement process is an important priority. While the discussions on the recommendations to open accession negotiations with North Macedonia and Albania will continue, we firmly believe that the EU must continue to pay special attention to the Western Balkans. This is a region of high strategic value for the EU, and the enlargement policy continues to be a strategic investment in the stability, security and development of the EU's immediate neighbourhood. The European perspective for the partners in the region must be advanced, based on their own merits and on criteria specific for the process. Our presidency continues to support Serbia's strategic choice of joining the European Union and welcomes the overall progress made in the accession negotiations so far. We are putting a great deal of effort into advancing the work with Serbia, and we hope to be able to open further negotiation chapters in December. However, as you well know, the pace of accession negotiations will continue to depend on Serbia's own progress and reform efforts, in particular in the key area of the rule of law and in the normalization of relations with Kosovo. It's therefore important that Serbia takes ownership, fully commits to European values, and ensures the vigorous pursuit of necessary reforms, also in the interest of its people. As set out in the Council conclusions on enlargement and stabilisation and association process from last June, the fundamental areas of the accession process remain the rule of law, fundamental rights, the functioning of democratic institutions and public administration reform, as well as economic development and competitiveness. Serbia has continued to work towards aligning its legislation with the acquis in a number of areas. Still, however, there is a need to significantly accelerate reform efforts and deliver concrete and tangible results in those fundamental areas, and particularly on the rule of law. As underlined by the Council, a special focus still needs to be put on independence and overall efficiency of the judiciary, where completing and implementing the constitutional reform is of particular importance. The lack of progress in the area of freedom of expression continues to raise serious concern. Let me recall that the Council has called on Serbia to guarantee a safe climate conducive to the unhindered exercise of freedom of expression and the independence of the media as a matter of urgency, including by stepping up efforts to investigate cases of attacks against journalists. Serbia should also, as a matter of priority, adopt and effectively implement the media strategy in a transparent and inclusive manner. Moreover, and of a particular importance for this forum, are the matters of transparency, quality of lawmaking, inclusiveness and genuine cross-party debate. These elements need to be enhanced so as to ensure the proper functioning of democratic institutions, including parliamentary oversight. In view of the upcoming parliamentary elections, the previous recommendations of international election observers need to be addressed as a matter of priority so that this is done sufficiently ahead of the elections. On economic governance, we welcome the positive developments in the Serbian economy. In order to further boost competitiveness and long-term and inclusive growth, continuous efforts are needed through structural reforms, and this goes in particular for the energy sector and the labour market. Furthermore, it remains important to improve transparency and predictability in the regulatory environment. We welcome Serbia's continued active participation in missions and operations under the EU's common security and defence policy. In relation to EU's common foreign and security policy, let me underline that Serbia, as a country negotiating accession to the EU, is expected to fulfil its commitment and progressively align with the EU. Regional cooperation and good neighbourly relations continue to be essential elements of the enlargement process. We note Serbia's continued engagement in a number of regional cooperation initiatives in Southeast Europe. Sustained efforts to strengthen good neighbourly relations should continue. I would also like to use this occasion to commend Serbia's efforts and constructive cooperation on migration in the Western Balkans region. Regarding the normalisation of relations between Serbia and Kosovo, we hope that the current difficulties will be overcome and that Serbia will remain engaged in the EU-facilitated dialogue and will focus on the future with a view to comprehensive normalisation of relations between Serbia and Kosovo. The Council will continue to monitor this issue in the framework of Serbia's EU accession negotiations under Chapter 35. Co-chairs, honourable members, ladies and gentlemen, let me conclude by reiterating that Serbia should actively pursue the necessary reforms for the benefit of its people. Bearing in mind that the EU is by far Serbia's first economic and political partner, Serbia should also clearly communicate about its stated commitments in the public debate. I would also like to use this occasion to once again commend the continuous engagement of this committee and its contribution to EU-Serbia relations and to Serbia's accession process. We also highly value the overall support of the European Parliament to the enlargement policy of the EU. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Mr. Mateja Nocic-Šamca, Deputy Head of the EU Delegation, Serbia has the floor. You have the floor, ma'am. Thank you very much.
Chair, I am today in the position of chargé d'affaires of the delegation, as my ambassador is out of the country, and not only as the deputy. He will for sure not miss such an important event. Dear Minister, dear chairpersons, dear Ambassador Ladevirta, honourable members, colleagues. It is my great pleasure also to be here today on behalf of the European Commission for this 11th Stabilisation and Association Committee to exchange with you on the state of play of the accession negotiations in EU-Serbia relations. We spoke at length about the European Council's decision on our neighbours Albania and North Macedonia, and I have to reiterate here that the EU commitments to the European perspective of the Western Balkans remains unchanged. And to be very clear, it means that the EU integration of Serbia and the entire Western Balkans region remains an important strategic policy in our mutual interest. And that is why the EU will revisit these issues not before at the EU Western Balkans Leaders Summit in Zagreb next May. And this is why it is extremely important for Serbia to continue the reform process and speed it up, and I'm very glad to hear what the Minister was saying about it. We are here today to confirm the EU constitution, continued support to Serbia and on keeping a credible perspective on future accession. And when we're talking about the negotiations, I would just to stress a few figures which you, I think, all know, that Serbia is almost halfway there in terms of the number of opened chapters. As of June 2019, Serbia has opened 17 of a total 35 negotiation chapters, and 2 of which have already been provisionally closed. We all want a positive signal for the region and for further chapters to be opened later this year. And for this to happen, we also hear that around the table, Serbia should accelerate as much needed reforms, particularly on the rule of law. The forthcoming non-paper, and it we heard as well on the rule of law, to be presented to Council during the second half of November, will be the basis for our member states to give their agreement for further openings. Serbia needs to deliver convincing results, including a sustainable track record, in particular in areas of concern such as the judiciary, freedom of expression, the fight against corruption and organized crime. But as you all know, the real progress in the end is not in opening the chapters, but rather in closing them. And this will happen only when the necessary reforms are there. When we talk about the democratic governance and elections, I have to say that another political priority for Serbia must be to strengthen its democratic institutions. The Parliament's role in advancing the EU reform agenda and holding the government accountable is absolutely crucial. It is therefore Serbia's top political priority to strengthen democratic governance. Serbia is currently in a pre-election period. In light of the parliamentary elections in spring 2020, inclusive and transparent electoral reform is crucial. And we have taken note of the inter-party dialogue that has taken place, facilitated by the civil society organization and more recently by the colleagues of the European Parliament. I'm happy and glad that one of the members to continue is also going to be one of the co-chairs. The Parliament and the government have committed to a number of welcome initiatives aiming to improve the level playing field, also through the recently established working group on the elections. However, what counts at the end of the day are the results in practice, leading to a tangible improvement of the electoral sphere. I have to underline that time is pressing if substantial progress is to be made before the arrival of the needs assessment mission. I recall at the center of all the reforms, inclusiveness and transparency remain key. Building trust and fostering constructive work relations with all stakeholders is essential. When speaking about the rule of law, area of fundamental importance and also determining the speed of the overall accession negotiations, as we already heard before, I would have to stress key issues. One is the constitutional reform process, which aims at strengthening the independence and accountability of the judiciary. It is important for the constitutional reform to be continued and finalized. The Parliament's role is key as the institution which is now in lead of the process. Freedom of expression is a fundamental value of the EU and thus a keystone on the enlargement process. We are pleased that the government last version of the media strategy was sent to Brussels. Once Brussels comments the last version, the words need to be put into action, and it is the implementation of this media that counts. One of the rule of law areas are also the fight against corruption and organized crime. It is positive for us that Serbia implements the law on organization and jurisdiction of state authorities in the fight against organized crime, terrorism, and corruption. However, Serbia is yet to establish a convincing track record on investigations, indictments, and final convictions in high-level corruption and organized crime. When speaking about the economic reforms, Serbia has made good progress, the results which can be seen in the country's strong economic performance. In order to consolidate and grow this success, there is a need for Serbia to implement better fiscal planning for a fairer and more predictable business environment and for increase in public investment. Serbia also needs to focus on the still unreconstructed public companies, in particular in energy sector. I have to tackle also the normalization of relations with Kosovo, and here Belgrade's commitment to remain constructively engaged in the dialogue on the normalization is crucial for the overall progress in Serbia's negotiations and also key for the entire region. We recall that a comprehensive, legally binding agreement is crucial for Serbia and Kosovo to advance on the European path, as well as for the stability and peace in the region. I have to tackle also the regional cooperation and good neighbourly relations. Impetus for the EU enlargement perspective of the Western Balkans will materialize only if all countries cooperate and move forward together from past conflicts. Overall, we are pleased to see that Serbia maintained its engagement in a number of regional cooperation initiatives. In southeastern Europe, such as the Southeast European Cooperation Process, SEFTA, the Western Balkan 6 Initiative, and the Berlin Plus, to name a few. We appreciate this continued commitment by Serbia despite the difficult current situation of which we are all aware. I will speak slightly about the EU perceptions, and I have to stress here that EU is by far the country's first economic and political partner and the largest donor of financial assistance, with no possible comparison with other partners of Serbia. In the latest public opinion poll in Serbia, citizens perceive, and I'm very glad, that EU is the biggest donor. We see this as a positive development, however, this trend needs to be further strengthened. We need to see recognition of our contribution at the highest level as part of the country's strategic commitment towards the goal of the EU accession. The numbers are very telling. In the past 12 years, Serbia has received over 3.3 billion as grants from the European Commission, and these have not to be repaid. Also, 2/3 of Serbia's trade is with the EU, and the 2/3 of the foreign direct investment in Serbia comes from the EU. Since the EU and Serbia signed the Stabilisation Association Agreement in 2008, Serbia's exports to the EU almost tripled. These exports grow every year by over 10%. Serbia has become a very attractive destination for EU foreign direct investment. When to conclude, I would say the EU accession is the national priority for Serbia, as also repeated several times when speaking today with the Prime Minister, and included as such in the recently adopted security and defence policy. It is therefore also important that this national priority is coherently reflected in the public narrative, in the reforms undertaken, highlighting the benefits to the citizens, and also in the foreign policy actions of Serbia, because Serbia's actions are not only observed here locally, but also internationally. Finally, let me stress that the Commission will support Serbia in its EU-related reforms in every way it can. We will continue to use all the tools at our disposal, ranging from political dialogue to technical and financial assistance, to support Serbia's EU-related reforms and to further Serbia's EU integration. I wish you a successful session today and tomorrow. Thank you.
Hvala vam. Pre nego što nastavimo sa izvestiocima odbora, komentar.
Comment by Minister Joksimovic before we hear the rapporteurs. I'm not going to comment on the speech, the content of speech of Madam Nocic-Stanche, but the Finnish ambassador comes from a country which has recognized the independence of Kosovo, and he can say Kosovo. But Madam Stančić, you represent the European Union. The European Union has the obligation of status neutrality. So you have to designate these two entities in keeping with that, as we have agreed. And please keep to that in the future. The European Union has to honor this status of neutrality. Thank you. Thank you, all representatives of institutions. We now continue with the representatives, rapporteurs of the Parliamentary Committee. Madame Fayon.
Thank you very much, and also thank you to the Minister for a very in-depth state of play. I, of course, would like first to mention that since our last meeting before December, Serbia has opened another chapter, Chapter 9 on financial services. And altogether we have 17 chapters, as you mentioned, and 3 we heard today also for the Minister of Interior are in the pipeline of opening possibly till the end of this year. But as you rightly mentioned, we have a new methodology. We have also the interim benchmarks, and they are related to the chapters 23 and 24. So we do hope there will be a significant or sufficient progress from your side. And I would personally very much like to see that Serbia could open additional chapters by the end of the year, because that, of course, would be a very positive signal to the country. Therefore, I strongly, of course, support your words saying that Serbia remains a constructive partner to the EU. That is very important because, frankly, we here are friends of Serbia, and we also would like to see from our side that we can be helpful in this process of Serbia towards the EU. When it comes to the rule of law, we, as I said, this morning the Minister of Interior, who is also the coordinator for the Chapter 24, very important one. And when we discuss the rule of law also in the member states of the European Union, there cannot be a democratic state without free courts, without independent courts, without free media. And also, if you have an independent court or judiciary, you can attract foreign investment. So the rule of law, I think, it's the core of our societies. And this is also the key for Serbia's process or progress towards the EU. So I would like to stress the importance of the rule of law. When it comes to the media freedom, I was a journalist myself, and I regret to see the international data when it comes to Serbia, that Serbia has fallen on additional 14 places in 2019 compared to last year, and now ranks the 90th in the world. So I'm speaking about the data out of 180 countries in World Press Freedom Index. This is the report by journalists or Reporters Without Borders. And this report clearly states that Serbia has become a place where practicing journalism is neither safe nor supported by the state. And in the last Commission's progress report, you well remember that this report notes no progress in the area of freedom of expression, and Serbia was downgraded from free to partly free. I have to say that this is a real reason of concern. And this is also what we hear with discussing in Serbia with all our partners, especially, or regretfully from those that are or boycotting or part of the opposition or critical civil society, that I am pleased to see that it's very vivid and very dynamic in the country. But they are all warning us on the lack of media freedom. I congratulated today to Serbian Prime Minister, who submitted strategic or media strategy to Brussels. And I do hope that we'll get some positive remarks on this media strategy that is crucial to establish media freedom and media pluralism in the country. I'm also aware that the Parliament will have a public debate, and I welcome that on the 12th of November on media landscape, also on the role of REM as a guardian of the electronic media. This is very important, and I do hope that this open dialogue on the 12th of November in the Parliament, bringing together all the stakeholders, will lead to independent and transparent REM as an independent body. We still have a lot of concerning information about the violence and intimidation against journalists that should not be taken in a country aspiring to join the EU, also in this institution. You may correct me, but we have this noted down, and I would like to hear also your opinion on that. Serbia needs a pluralistic media landscape with adequate financing and safeguards to protect journalists. There are pending cases of violence against journalists, also killings, and we rarely see some proper epilogue of those cases. And we firmly condemn any interference in the activities of media and journalists, including in the context of the elections. And we all are aware, even though there is no official election campaign, that as politicians, Serbia is entering in the electoral campaign. Therefore, the media freedom and media pluralism is very crucial. When it comes to the parliamentary procedures, I fully agree with the Commission report of this year, saying that the polarized political scene in Serbia is having a very negative impact on the work of democratic institutions, especially the parliament. And I have to agree that I share the concerns about the boycott of the parliament. We are aware today that still around 40 members are not present, but I do hope that before the elections there is still a place to maneuver, to bring them back to the votes and to have Parliament fully functioning, because the dialogue is in the Parliament, not out of the Parliament. This is also our firm stand. And I would urgently call you to create space for a very genuine cross-party debate, and also to create conditions for participation by the opposition in Parliament, where we welcome the first positive signs that I have to say. This is that the filibustering has stopped. I also yesterday spoke with the Speaker of the Parliament. Annual reports by independent bodies were discussed for the first time since 2014. We welcome that, but unfortunately the practice of grouping unrelated but significant items on the agenda in one session was still maintained in a few cases, and legislative amendments tabled by the few remaining opposition members are getting hardly discussed. So this is still something clearly to be changed. And more attention should be paid to the implementation of the recommendations by independent bodies. There is still plenty of room for improving the quality of legislative debate and Parliament's oversight role, which should not be regarded as a formal but as a substantial exercise. So we sincerely hope that the mediation efforts of the European Parliament, next round will be in the mid of November, will contribute to improving existing practices and standards in this regard. When it comes to the protests by the opposition parties that have been ongoing in order to improve electoral conditions ahead of the spring elections, we saw some good initiatives by civil society. I mentioned already before, during the summer when a dialogue started between the ruling party and the opposition on the elections, there are quite some ongoing parallel process of dialogue, which is very important, and we welcome also the recent efforts of the Faculty of Political Science of the University of Belgrade, and several Serbian NGOs facilitate dialogue between the ruling coalition and the opposition. We also met some of them today. We had an opportunity to discuss with them, and we also welcome their efforts to continue in December as civil society, to give a platform, but also we welcome the engagement of the Minister of Interior, who is in a dialogue with the OSCE and ODIHR, which is quite important. We observe with anxiety that the biggest opposition alliance is tilting towards refusing to take part in the elections next year, and part of the opposition has also been boycotting the workings, as I mentioned, of the National Assembly. So we regret that the opposition parties from the Alliance for Serbia did not join the first round of the dialogue mid of October, facilitated by the European Parliament, and we are now, of course, preparing the ground for the next round in mid of November, and I do hope that we can bring both sides closer together. As you know, we prefer dialogue and elections, than the boycott, which we consider an extreme political solution that sometimes can do more harm than good. And electoral boycott hardly ever brought about the required political change. Elections, however, are a window of opportunity, and of course this remains, or it takes a lot of hard work on all sides, which in the end may or may not bring about the required results. And we are really here to find the way forward, also in facilitating you to make the elections fair and democratic. And we do hope that despite this current very tense or polarized political atmosphere, the European Parliament's mediation will be conducive to an agreement by all parties to agree on common rules for the polls. And today we also had the opportunity to meet with the working group and discuss the situation to see what is the current work they are doing and how much still remains to be done. I would like to mention still some recommendations that I find, and also my delegation, extremely important. This is to keep on with open consultation on the role and conduct of the media regulatory body, the REM, I mentioned before, addressing a key concern of ODIHR and civil societies and opposition actors. You know that we have some shortfalls that we have still to address before the next round of the dialogue in the Parliament, in particular with regard to creating a level playing field for all political parties to be present, participating in the elections, including having equal access to the media and especially the public broadcaster RTS and RTV. It's important that all such proposals are subject to transparent procedures, public consultations, including full parliamentary scrutiny. Therefore, once again, I welcome that there will be a public debate, but we have to, or you have to, in our support, create conditions that we will have independent media landscape. On the reform of the judiciary, independent judiciary, free from political influence, and other bodies responsible for maintaining rule of law, fighting corruption, and respecting fundamental rights are key to a well-functioning democratic state, society, and in that sense, constitutional amendments should allow for merit-based judicial recruitment and careers, and independent bodies in Serbia, such as REM or Anti-Corruption Agency and Deputy Protector of Citizens, need to be fully acknowledged and empowered to exercise their monitoring and oversight role very properly and effectively. Finally, or almost finally, the EU facilitated dialogue with Pristina. Despite our disappointment with regard to the standstill of the last rounds of the dialogue in Brussels and our concern about the rise of tensions between Belgrade and Pristina on certain occasions since our last SAPC meeting in Brussels, we hope that both sides remain committed to the EU-led dialogue with the aim of reaching a legally binding agreement in the coming months. We are aware that Kosovo is becoming one of the topics again in also these coming elections, but I do hope that after the establishing of a government in Pristina, that the dialogue will continue. We got also some reassurances today from the Prime Minister. On the foreign policy alignment, some last words on foreign policy alignments, on Russia. Finally, on Serbia's alignment with Russia, this is when it comes to the alignment in general with the foreign policy of the EU. Currently, Serbia is the lowest in the alignment in the region. This is, of course, the matter of the concern. We are well aware that Russia is a traditional geopolitical ally of Serbia, with strong historic and religious ties, and in the past Moscow has provided diplomatic support to Serbia within the United Nations, investment, economic and military aid, and Serbia is heavily dependent on Russian gas supplies. And in return, Serbia resisted EU pressure to apply sanctions on Russia over its aggression on Ukraine. So on October 25, Serbia signed a deal to join the Russian-led Euro-Asian Economic Union, including also Armenia, Belarus, Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. And let us make it clear, this bloc was established by Russian President Putin to create a rival to the EU's open market and help rebuild Moscow's sphere of influence in the former Soviet Union and beyond. And obviously, if Serbia is serious about its European orientation, it should then make political decisions that brings it closer to it. And this is not one of them. In any case, the Commission has already made it clear Serbia will have to cancel bilateral trade agreements with other countries if and when it joins the EU, and we can only reconfirm this message. And on China, last not least, we are increasingly concerned by Serbia's intensifying ties with China. We are aware that for China, Serbia represents a crucial transport corridor and energy hub, as China's main future trade route to the European market is set to be Piraeus Belgrade-Budapest corridor, with a 3.2 billion euro high-speed rail project announced in 2014, and a contract to buy 9 wing-long Chinese military drones and the transfer of technology to the Pegasus military drones program that Serbia has been developing internally are also cause for concern. Chinese police patrols on the streets of Belgrade and a Huawei contract for Belgrade Safe City project, which envisions mounting hundreds of surveillance cameras with facial recognition software, meanwhile signal that Serbia's geopolitical orientation has become increasingly unclear. And the Chinese investments' lack of transparency also raises concerns about Serbia's commitment to applying EU rules on competition, state aid and government procurement. So, having said all that critical remarks, it is time for Serbia to unambiguously state its future aspiration and Euro-Atlantic political orientation in line with its strategic goal of EU membership, especially after the Commission 2019 country report earlier this year showed that Serbia is only partially aligning its foreign and security policy with the EU's. So that concludes my remarks on this first point, and we are, of course, happy to hear your remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You'd allow me to follow up as one of the speakers which enlisted for this point. Dear colleagues, dear participants, the period which elapsed since our last joint meeting was marked by the achievement of various results in our process of European integrations. We are quite pleased with what was done. We are fully aware also that we have to do a lot. Our progress here is synonymous with our European integration process, and the timeline will become more and more certain. The reforms that we started in 2014, aiming to provide better life for all our citizens, are showing important effects. We can increase now our salaries in pensions. Our unemployment was considerably reduced from 26% in 2011-2012 to 10% now, with a tendency of even greater decrease of unemployment. Equally, average salary is considerably higher. Besides the economic reforms, a lot of effort was invested in the reform of judiciary, rule of law, and our fight against corruption and organized crime. Serbia is not anymore under the FATF monitoring because we have introduced the agreed collective measures, and we will continue collaborating with regional bodies in this area, and we are going to fight against the threats to international financial system. Peace, collaboration, local and globally, respect of international law are the key definitions of our both internal and external activities. Serbia is actively taking part in many regional initiatives and processes. We strengthen our relationships with our neighbors. We stay convinced that the stability and security of the region can be achieved only through cooperation and respect of international law. Political and economic cooperation, and creating joint strategies for economic development. This brings to strengthening the policies of reconciliation, and the initiative to sign joint declaration for the creation of an area of the free flow of people and capitals in the Western Balkans, the so-called small Schengen with non-Macedonia and Albania, is an important thing, and this is a Serbian idea. I have to stress this is our initiative. Taking part in the missions and operations of the European Union and UN, international missions, Serbia shows our firm commitment to contribute to regional and world security and respect of international law. Serbia opts for European integrations, not Euro-Atlantic integrations. We are stay confirmed for military independence, Euro-Atlantic integrations, no. European integrations, yes, therefore. Kosovo and Metohija issue is definitely one of the key issues, key questions for our future European integration process. The Belgrade-Pristina dialogue stalls. There is no progress there because of the host of unilateral Pristina measures like anti-civilizational 100% taxes, which are a flagrant breach of CEFTA and SAA agreements, breaches into northern coastal municipalities, not fulfilling what was agreed in Brussels agreement, the attempt to create the so-called Kosovo army in contravention of the 1244 resolution, abuse of the cultural heritage, reducing the freedom of movement, physical attacks, and so on, which makes it very clear that one does not only need to respect the right to identity, language, and culture. We are talking the right to life, and no international legal arguments can be invoked against that. However, Serbia stands ready to continue the dialogue as soon as the taxes are revoked and to continue talking following the principles of international right, international justice, to find a compromise solution for the benefit of the whole region. The meeting, which was supposed to take place, the continuation of the dialogue, was cancelled due to the lack of cooperation on the Pristina side. What is worrying is what we hear from Pristina of lately, that all agreements will be scrutinized and reconsidered again, which really disrespects everything that EU has done. We wish, dear colleagues, we would like to see European Union to have more understanding for Belgrade. We do not want European Union to take our sides, but to stand by the letter of the agreement. That's what Serbia expects, no more, no less. Serbia sees European Union as a credible mediator in the dialogue, and that's we are calling for the European Union to be more proactive in this situation. When we talk about the cooperation of the civil society, they're involved in many elements of the decision-making, considerably in the process of European integration. We collaborate with a national convent, which is an important part of our negotiation process, but elsewhere as well. Just to inform the present participants, after the recommendations from the progress report of the Commission, the National Assembly of Serbia introduced a series of measures to improve the work here in the House, which reduced the number of laws adopted by extraordinary procedures, the number of amendments, and the number of agenda points. The reports of independent bodies were debated in plenary. We have independent hearings, and we'll have an independent agenda item for the budget with twice as long debate time for the first time. And we hope our European partners not just to take note of this, but to commend these changes because they are along the lines of the European recommendations and go even further than what was recommended. Regarding the future elections in spring 2021, I would like to underline how important it is that we have an inter-party dialogue in the Assembly with the mediation of the European Parliament. European Parliament recognized this House as the place where political differences should be settled, and we hope that the opposition in Serbia will recognize that. We've heard who they are today because they're still refusing to take part in this dialogue. For your information, refusing to take part in the work of the Assembly is, currently we have less than half of the opposition deputies sitting here in the House now are refusing to take part in the work of the Parliament. This is the neglect of the Parliament, the contempt of the Parliament, the contempt of the Assembly, and this is anti-European behavior. So we are very thankful for our European partners to sending this message as well. When we talk about the elections and pre-electoral dialogue, we put in the same context the protests which are organized in Serbia, protests which are very low in intensity, the number of participants also. But regardless of that, regardless of the number of people, this should not be the key factor. The protests are free, they're not restricted, they can move around, they can state their demands, they can send political messages. Often these protests are not announced, but we do not impede them. They are not, because in Serbia nobody has any problems to hear opinions expressed publicly and send messages and send messages and state opinions. But we are in agreement with our European partners. What worries us is that the violence that can be seen in the protests and violence elsewhere is absolutely unacceptable. Us here and our friends from the European Parliament and representatives of the different institutions like European Federation of Journalists, etc., did condemn strongly the violence that we saw when the demonstrators broke into the building of the national broadcasters of Serbia, and all the sort of damage that was inflicted to public property. So these are the models of behavior that we have assessed as anti-democratic and anti-European. Maybe, dear colleagues, you are informed about what took place and you got this letter, but considering that I've got the letter personally by the deputy speaker of the Belgrade Assembly, and she is pointing out to some very dramatic events, and she sent this to our parliamentary committee, the recent violence that the deputy mayor of Belgrade was submitted to when he was promoted his book, and she is informing you, dear colleagues, and there is the letter in English to send it to Mrs. Fajon, and we are witnessing not only anti-systemic, but the very anti-democratic behavior, promoting the institutions of violence instead of elections as way of gaining power in the country. I think we have to bear this in mind when we talk about the political situation in Serbia. The freedom of media, of course, is something to be taken into account. There are different lists, different ratings that world experts and stakeholders, experts' opinion are making. They're following the situation in different countries year in, year out. We have the World Press Freedom Index, and in every meeting of this committee, we are looking at the place Serbia has at the World Press Freedom Index, and there were times when Serbia moved forward, when Serbia slid back, but currently I think Serbia is positioned higher than what it had in 2012 on the very same list. Freedom House also has its own list. We also mentioned Freedom House list. And Mrs. Sara Repucci, who countersigned this report of Freedom House, recently said that Serbia is a democratic country, which shows the opinion of the Freedom House, how they view Serbia and our country. The list by the London magazine Economist ranks Serbia in the same democratic category as the USA, so I think this is a message into itself, so same level of democracy. And when we look at the list of Kate Fraser and Liberales Institute of the Friedrich Neumann Stiftung, the so-called Index of Human Freedoms, tells that Serbia is at the record high place when you look at individuals' freedoms and economic freedoms and personal freedoms, if I'm not wrong. If we compare it with 2012, when we had the record low in Serbia. So ever since then, since 2012, we are only making progress here in Serbia. And now we are at a record high, 51st place, better than ever. I'll give you a few more statistics. The statistical analysis of the Independent Association of Journalists of Serbia. The number of physical attacks against the journalists is 10 times less than in 2011-2012. Last report for last year, we had 7 or 8 physical attacks on the journalists. In 2012, we had some 70 physical attacks against the journalists, which I think is a great move in the right direction. We will all agree. Of course, the support of the European Parliament for all these issues is precious, because the European Parliament offers support for the continuous protection and affirmation of European values in our country, because, as you can see, we want to implement these values and to make them stand high. And Serbia recognizes European values as our own values. The progress assessment for every country, of course, is based on individual merits. We stay committed to our European reforms, stay committed to our European way, and we hope that enlargement policy in Europe will gain more and more importance, because that's what European Union means. This will consolidate the peace and prosperity within European Union, but also the Western Balkans. We would not make a mistake if we say that it will make more situation better in the Western Balkans and therefore in the European Union. Now I'll open the floor for discussion. Mrs. Joksimovic, yes, please. I'm sitting here as a government representative. I have to present some answers and comments which touches only not the work of the Parliament but the work of the Serbian government. I envy you, Mrs. Fajon, for being a deputy member of parliament. You can be free interpreting the facts the way you see them, which is the nice thing when you are an MP. When you are a government member, you have to be and you have to speak in a more concerned way. You have to choose your words more. I wouldn't answer you in the way I would if I were a parliament member. I cannot speak like that. But what I would like to say is that I was surprised by one thing, and then we will analyze everything you said. In the beginning of your speech, when you compared European Union with the Habsburg monarchy, for me, comparing Europe with Habsburgs, it's interesting, it's legitimate, but how the people living in Habsburg monarchy, even in the country from which you're coming from, how they've called the Habsburg monarchy, and God forbid, they look at the European Union as the dungeon, the prison of peoples, as the Slavic peoples were looking at the Habsburgs. European Union is an association of peoples joined in all their differences, but of course all historical comparisons are legitimate. I have no problems with it. But after all these historical analysis and other analyses, which are based partly in the European Commission reports and some data that you have quoted, and I think Mrs. Orlic really answered well in his speech. But regarding the media strategy and the media scene, the media environment. Of course, you as a former journalist, you have a special feeling for your own brood, for your own kind, you have the birds of the same feather with the journalists. Of course, we're interested for that, but I would like to remind you the initiative of our president. Thanks to his initiative, the work on the media strategy was relaunched. The credibility of the process came into question because certain journalistic associations refused to take part in this process, which is of key importance for them. So we reviewed the draft and we started working on it again with additional consultations with the OSCE, and I think this raised the level of transparency and inclusion, and of course the level of competence is present because OSCE could help a lot in this work. So the final draft was agreed with the final meeting of the working group with the Prime Minister very recently, the day before yesterday, on the 28th of October this year. And this final draft will be sent to the European Commission. If I was informed well, it was sent officially to the Commission today, actually. So that's the result of the work of a very large working group, government members, media associations, European delegation here, OSCE. It was very transparent. We had public debates. And when you add it all up, it was a year-long process. And I think this was an added value, added quality, even if the price for it was that we did go beyond, we did break some deadlines, go beyond some deadlines, but like when we talk about constitutional reforms, the quality is what matters, even if some of the steps in the process do last longer than the deadlines. This will affect the assessment of the European Commission, but I think often from the European Commission we get verbal cues, verbal support, verbal cautions, verbal support, saying always, we hear from Europe, always from the Commission, quality before speed, before the speed is before haste, so quality is more important than haste. When we talk about the attacks against the journalists, Mr. Orlic gave you the statistics. But, all cases that were declared to the prosecutor, since we have the MOU between the prosecution and the police, all were processed. Some indictments were already, some people were already indicted. In some cases, we have the pre-criminal investigations, evidence gathering. You can get all the data, which can be of relevant interest for all future resolutions that the European Parliament will pass. What is here also, what we can witness here, we hear about journalists are attacked, situation in Serbia catastrophic. I wouldn't say it is good that in Serbia, unlike European member states, here in Serbia we do not have the assassinations of journalists like in European member states. Unfortunately, in Bulgaria, in Malta, Slovakia, we have this unsolicited, undesired events, the journalists were assassinated. But what Serbia did, and this government did, and previous government started the assassinations of journalists which were unresolved in Serbia. We have a special group which Veran Matić was heading, if I remember well, and this group was working towards the solution clarification of these assassinations of journalists which were not resolved for more than 20 years in Serbia. Some cases were even resolved, progress was made. I wouldn't go into details now, we all know that. So yes, I do agree that media strategy, when we hear the comments on media strategy, when we have the action plan, then the action plan will be the part of the new legislation activity, the new laws, and so on. So there is a host of procedural steps which we implementation is important, but you cannot have goodwill is there, but there is the goodwill, political and European support and OSCE and all other partners, and I believe everybody else, all our members, institutions in Serbia, and I believe that we are going to achieve better results and Serbian rankings in the future will be better. As far as the anti-corruption is concerned,
in the recent report, it was assessed that Serbia did meet all the recommendations of GRECO when it comes to a set of legislative acts, framework related to the fight against corruption. Of course, we expect full implementation. Many cases of corruption have been treated and there is a positive track record, but the anti-corruption fight is a topic which will be dealt with by us and by everybody who is in the EU, and that will be followed up after we become a member. So, of course, the adoption of a legal framework is not the end. The implementation then starts. As for the electoral conditions, I believe that Serbia and the government of the Republic of Serbia have made a political concession by accepting the European Parliament mediation. Let me tell you why. I believe that that is positive, because I believe that Serbia is a front-runner in the process. It has responsibility. We are assuming responsibility. But if you deal with the region, and I know, Mrs. Fajon, that you know the region very well, you know the candidates and the candidates for the candidate status, let me not mention any names. Let me not be diplomatically unfair. But what is the situation in the parliaments in the region like? It cannot be compared to what particularly is a problem in the parliamentary practice of Serbia, but nobody was offered this kind of mediation. I believe that Serbia has shown a surplus responsibility, which we do feel as a candidate that is making a progress. So we accepted the mediation of Mr. Kukan, MEP, who is now an ex-MEP, and Mr. Fleckenstein, who is familiar with the situation, and he constructively contributed to this dialogue. I believe that this too should be taken into consideration, which we sometimes forget. I believe that Serbia has shown that the government of Serbia is not trying to escape or to avoid any topic. And we embark upon sensitive topics, and we want to improve in a transparent manner what the law that was commended in the past by the European Union as one of the best electoral laws, which of course does not mean that the conditions cannot be improved. In cooperation with OSCE and ODIHR, we have already since 2017 embarked upon this process, namely implementation of the recommendations that were given by ODIHR, and now I believe that we are on the right path when it comes to improving the election conditions. As for the opposition that is boycotting the elections, it is paradoxical for us to talk about it not taking into consideration that there is a parliamentary opposition in Serbia. We have several parties who are very active in the work of the parliament, those that are boycotting, that is the Alliance for Serbia, and one non-parliamentary party. How can a non-parliamentary party talk about boycotting the election? How do you intend to become a parliamentary party? If I were you, I would ask that question, but they have been also invited to participate in the discussions within the parliament, which is important. And briefly, when it comes to our relations with China and the Russian Federation, that is important. You mentioned the signing of the agreement with Euro-Asian Union on the 25th of October this year. Of course, we are aware of the fact that by our joining the EU, the validity of these agreements will be terminated. That is not questionable. We know what our obligations are under SAE and what our obligations will be after joining. As for the trade relations between individual EU member states and the Russian Federation, it grew last year between 25 and 30%, even though there is this sanctions regime. And this applies to some of the biggest EU countries, meaning that the economic policy finds its way, because it is in everybody's interest of the EU and the Russian Federation, which is probably suffering the economic damages. But on the other hand, the economies of the EU states are also suffering the damage. When it comes to the influence of China, you mentioned that Serbia is like a central hub, but let me remind you, dear Tanya, that the entire group, C16+1, now it is already C17+1, are mostly countries of the European Union, EU member states, who participate in the program of One Belt, One Road, or whatever it is called, where precisely the idea is in mutual interest and complying with certain procedures, and I do advocate the respect for EU procedures, no doubt about that, but we need to find the models by which China can improve its competitiveness when it comes to infrastructure. And on the other hand, China has its own interest, which is clear geopolitically, economically, and politically, after all, when it comes to C17. So Serbia is not a country that should be highlighted as the main hub in this part of Europe. But within the platform, everybody should try to achieve some economic goals. So the circumstances in international relations are complex. Serbia does not wish this region, and the region itself does not want to be submitted to games of power. We are looking for our windows of opportunity. And in this stage of accession negotiations, as I mentioned earlier, not neglecting our strategic goal, we believe that there will be a sufficient understanding of the European Union, which the EU shows towards its own citizens. Everybody wants the economy of welfare, higher standard of living, so you should not have such a suspicion in your views of Serbia. Thank you, Mrs. Fajon. Just two brief comments. You mentioned the mediation, the dialogue in the Assembly, in the Parliament. Let us just remind us all that we offered a similar mediation to Northern Macedonia. They accepted it. Now we are happy to have this opportunity to work with Serbia in this way. So this is not the first time. When it comes to the reform of the election law, of course, what is required, it would be better if after ODIHR provided recommendations, implementation should have started. But, okay, the working group is working now. Some months later, we hope to speed up this process. Thank you. Thank you, Mrs. Fajon. This process was started earlier. At the previous parliamentary committee that is organized at the level of the institutions, the Republic Election Committee did report about all the measures taken by the Commission. As a result of these recommendations which you mentioned, those of OSCE and ODIHR. So I believe that we will have a good track record, and the recommendations that are being implemented now and that will be implemented in the future will provide good results, I hope. So now we can move on to an open debate. It is always difficult to stick to the timeline. Mr. Šormaz, Mr. Đurić, Mr. Rističević asked for the floor, then Mr. Jovanović, Mr. Šormaz. Since you asked for the floor in the later discussions, would you agree to discuss this point later on or now? Mr. Šormaz wants to speak now, Mr. Jovanović later on. Would anybody else wish to take the floor so that we can conclude the list? Mr. Đurić, you have the floor. Thank you, Chair. It was interesting to listen to this very lengthy discussion. It is a rare opportunity for us to have representatives of the executive authorities to take part in the parliamentary debate in this manner. I do not share the enthusiasm when it comes to the unwavering attentions of this government toward the EU integrations. Out of 35 chapters, we have 2 provisionally closed, 15 are open, 4 are ready, 3 are almost ready, which is a half success. As a Euro enthusiast, I would say that that is a failure, but that is equal to the social support for the EU integrations, which is smaller in our society than ever since 2002. I'm afraid that propaganda came up with the result, because if we ask the question of changeability of criteria when it comes to benchmarks in the process, well, then the question is, what is the motive for changing the benchmarks? Are changes provoked by the ambiguous messages sent by Serbia to its European partners? Because one day we celebrate in our media the military system Panzer or the military or Chinese efforts, and then the next day we celebrate something relating to the Europe. So it seems that the rating cannot be won otherwise but by pumping emotions, national emotions. In the election dialogue, where I participate actively, we will have an agenda item to that topic, so I will not refer to it now. The point of the dialogue is not for the European partners to provide their assessments and to read out the assessments of meritorious agencies, and then for the Serbian authorities to challenge such assessment. You can say that, thanks God, in Serbia there are no murders of journalists. But I will tell you, there were no murders of journalists because an attempted murder did not succeed, which is not a good comment about the democracy. One journalist's house was put on fire. The court procedure is underway, so I will not comment it further because we are not supposed to comment on the court proceedings from these rostrums. Well, as for Kosovo, this has nothing to do with the situation of democracy which this parliamentary committee is discussing. Please do not ask me who owns Kosovo. One representative of opposition which is not boycotting the parliament, who was waiting for the floor for 1.5 hours, should be allowed to speak, especially because you are dealing with an opposition MP who is Euro-enthusiastic. I believe that all of us here have the same goal. So thank you in advance. I do not expect from you to talk while I'm speaking. But this is what the parliamentary debate looks like when we relax a little, even in the presence of the European Parliament. This election dialogue was interesting. Everybody says everything was okay while Mr. Fleckenstein was in the room. Then he had to leave this room, and then you could hear all kinds of things. To go back to the European integration process, because the minister is here, let me try to interpret what she said at the beginning. We are going to have an item on the enlargement and internal reforms and how they impact the enlargement process and the change in the playing field. It was stated that we are not in the pre-accession, but that we are in the accession process, so the rules cannot be changed for us, if my understanding of what you said was correct. Okay, so we have signed some international agreements. I believe it's a fair play to implement long-term agreements without change in the rules. But what is confusing? President of the state said that the judge changed the rules and now we have to adjust. That was my quotation of what he said. Now, here and now, while we are here all together and while the executive authorities are represented here and MEPs, confirm, please confirm to us what you have said, which I would support, to the extent to which each of us is able to confirm or deny that in line with our capacities that we have. It is good that we heard that it is the goal of Serbia to have full-fledged membership in the EU. Why I believe that that is good? Because to proclaim a goal, the European values, or to proclaim the goal of European values only without full membership as a goal, that is a way in which the opponents of European integrations are concealing their opposition to European integrations, while at the same time they're implementing some other foreign policy agendas. In the party where I come from, it is necessary to say that our goal is full-fledged membership in the EU, which implies the European values, but not only that. To advocate values without full memberships is like a friendly football match. You play with much less motive, and that is why I greet what is stated here in practice, in public, and it should be confirmed in practice. Our dilemma is we do not have a dilemma that Serbia belongs to the West. Our children are there. Our businesses are there. That needs not be highlighted. Those are statistical data. But to achieve the goal of Serbia in the West, the European Union needs to more decisively insist on democratization, combat of corruption and organized crime, because nothing can be compared to these fundamental European values. On its side, Serbia has to speed up its work. Out of 35 chapters, 15 are open, 4 are ready. That is insufficient for this many years of on the path to integration. I know that there are some internal problems, but we cannot seek excuses like there is Brexit, because we have not done our duties completely. We know that Chapter 35 cannot be covered more speedy because of Kosovo. But what about technical chapters that depend almost only on us, rather than on some external hostile factor? What is slowing us down when it comes to the chapters on the protection of environment, food safety? Those are chapters to which Eurosceptics or Europhobes in our society are not opposed, no matter what their political rating is. So what is preventing us in that? Thank you. So it is in the interest of all of us in chapters like these for the process to be speeded up to the maximum. And I would like to offer the cherishing of a new enthusiasm relating to such activities that are of a technical nature more than political, because if we have good track record when it comes to such chapters where there is not so much opposition in our society, then the Euro enthusiasm will be brought back to our society, and Euroscepticism would be tackled. The authorities will sow their true and genuine European orientation and intention. Thank you. Mr. Rističević. Ladies and gentlemen, dear MPs, MEPs, as a person who comes from the People's Agricultural Party, I advocated our joining the European Economic Community. That was back in 1990, on the 20th of May. After that, sometime in 1993, I had to make a correction in my program to change something. So I did not switch parties like my colleagues. I did not come from a party that did not pike in the election in order to come here. The European Economic Community changed its name. It changed its name to European Community, so I had to change my program. Again, later, I had to say that I'm advocating the European Union when the name European Union was introduced. So it was not up to me. It was up to the former Yugoslavia. But nowadays, the European Community that has some problems is reminding me to the year 1978 and the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. Some unclear accounts, some bad accounts, looking for a different model. What should we think? You, ladies and gentlemen from the European Parliament, I don't need them anyway. So, what can we think about you after the situation with Northern Macedonia? They changed their name there. They did not recognize the outcome of the referendum. They brought MPs from the prisons to vote for the change in the name. After that, you just let them downstream. What can we think about you? We know what you think about us. Whether you will take us or not, that doesn't matter. What is important for me are chapters 11, 12, and 13. They are ideal chapters. I cannot tell our farmers how beneficial it will be for them if you join the EU. I don't know what it will be called in the future, but I will make another correction in my program, and I will wish to join that market and to have some incentives, some impetuses. 45% of your agrarian budget, your subsidies are 7 times bigger than ours. Our people are resourceful. With such high subsidies, we will have productivity very fast. At your level, our processing industry, as soon as we have a surplus, will be competitive. We will have, with these subsidies, cheaper raw materials, plant production, livestock production. So our processing industry will be more competitive in the regional market, as you call it, or in the Western Balkan, as you call it. We will be more competitive, and therefore we will be competitive in the EU. And maybe we will export even more, because at the moment our agricultural potentials are much bigger than what you require in your export. So I'm praying to God that we join the EU, even if I will have to change the names in my program. But you cannot prevent the Serbs from joining the EU. 20 to 25% of the Serbian population is already in the EU, part by part. Every year, 30 to 50,000 people join the EU. So why are you bothering? Take the whole country, make it, prevent all these troubles for us, make it possible for us to have a free flow of people. Serbs will get there anyway, so don't waste time. Take us as Serbia, and that's it. You mentioned the Habsburg monarchy, which is the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Do you know why we were there? You know why? Because the Ottoman Empire committed crimes in Kosovo and the environment there and the neighborhood there. So the Serbs came to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and they were received there. So it was as a result of the troubles that we went through. But you want to turn the situation around, and then you blame us, like Turkish influence, Russian influence. Well, we are not to be blamed. It's you. You don't want us. You are slow in taking us. Now we see what is happening to Northern Macedonia. How can we then persuade our population in anything? Our population believed in the EU. Three-quarters of our population were Euro enthusiasts, but the number went down. How can we maintain this desire of our population? How can it continue to be present in the Serbian society? Further, boycott. The boycott that you mentioned, Ms. Fajon, as the ruling parties, we are disappointed if our opposition will boycott the result. It will be a big, big disappointment. Well, to have this kind of opposition, they are so incapable. They are a benefit for the ruling parties. They chase utility workers. They chase not Mr. Vesic, who is deputy mayor, but they chase his driver. So it will be a loss for the authorities if they boycott the elections. But we may end up in getting a better quality, higher quality opposition. As for me, I am happy that they will not appear on my ballot. As a small party, I would wish Serbia to have a much better opposition, to have a creative opposition that will criticize the authorities. These people are not creative. They were created somewhere. So it will be a gain for the authorities if they do keep their word and boycott the elections. They don't want any conditions. We did not write these election rules. They wrote them, and now they want to apply them. We did not allocate frequencies to national and other broadcasters. We did not appoint any editors-in-chief. We did nothing of that, but all the rules and editors, they were the result of their work, and we will have the elections under their conditions.
Thank you, Mr. Rističević. This was the last MP who wanted to speak. Mr. Jovanović, your 2 minutes now. Thank you, co-chair and distinguished colleagues from the European Parliament. First and foremost, Serbia and the Serbian authorities have never had a problem of accepting all well-meant suggestions and consider all well-based criticism, but it cannot turn a blind eye or a deaf ear to criticism which is not substantiated, as we heard today. One of the critical dimensions of today's discussion was the field of the judiciary. I do have to remind you that in the year 2009, something occurred which no state could actually have endured, as Serbia did, because in 2009 the judiciary they tried to push the judiciary over the precipice into the abyss. Of course, this is a metaphor, precisely because at that time over 700 judges were chucked out of their courts to only return later, and this is something that you know. And since that time, we have had this unsound situation in the judiciary, and we are trying to heal it today. It would be fair for the European Union to state its opinion over these last 6 or 7 years. What has been done for the judiciary? What has the judiciary done? What have the authorities here done in order to secure the independence of the judiciary on the one hand and make it efficient on the other hand? It goes without saying that this is not easy, and of course, it requires a lot of additional work, a lot of more efforts for the situation to improve, given what was done before. But it is also fair to say that the authorities are doing that. I have to remind you of the fact that the procedure of the constitutional amendments and the implementation this procedure has started, and the Parliamentary, Legislative and Constitutional Issues Committee has already initiated the amendments to the Constitution. But, distinguished Madam Fayon, I wish to draw your attention to one danger. Our judiciary currently in the situation, in the state that it is in the state of healing that it is in, there is the risk, there is the danger that if now we embark upon a complete, totally judicial independence, which is an imperative, which is a goal, we can actually bring it into a different situation, namely alienation of the judges from both the authorities and the state. They will be alienated because we have to eradicate the problems that we have in our courts associated with false solidarity, meaning that inefficient judges are still doing their work. These are judges who used to be in that office in 2000 in a scandalous reappointment procedure. Still, the Assembly of the Republic of Serbia is this dam preventing such consequences from occurring. And my last sentence has to do with Kosovo. And as a citizen of the Republic of Serbia, I just cannot accept that if there are attacks on journalists from Serbia in the territory of the interim institutions in Pristina, that we can remain silent. This is not a reflection of democracy in Kosovo. Unfortunately, that is a reflection of violence, of the so-called fascist type activity, which is actually undermining and jeopardizing the rights of the Serbian population. This is something that we are witnessing every day, but sadly we have had no reaction to that from you, Mr. Shormas. Mr. Olic, you know that I appreciate you as a junior colleague, so that I will keep to the 2 minutes that you allotted to me. Initially, let me just say that as reminds what happened in the year 2009 and the reform of judiciary, my conscience is calm because as an MP, I voted against at that time, and I was not even the authorized representative of the caucus. I voted against, and it turned out that I was correct because after that, the European Parliament, the European Commission, the European Union, they all criticized that reform of the judiciary. Let me, however, say something, comment on what was said by the co-chair. I have to say a few things about the partnership of Serbia. This is important for me to say, and something about economic cooperation. You know, as far as I am familiar with some facts or things, matters, we all know about the Volvo brand of the automotive industry from Sweden. As far as I know, the new owners of Volvo is a Chinese company which invested in the territory of, practically speaking, the European Union. So, colleague Bogovic, as far as I know, you can correct me, the new owners are the Chinese company of Gorenje, which is a very famous factory here in the region. It has 3 plants here in Serbia. As far as I know, Gorenje has a new investor and owner from Chinese capital. So what's the problem if they bought a mine and the steel works in Serbia? Why is that a problem? I come from the city where this iron plant is, iron and steel foundry, etc. This U.S. Steel was there. They are now in Košice. In Košice, they are still getting subsidies and subventions. But the previous authorities did not want to agree on a subsidy policy with them, and they left. And this city that I'm talking about and the whole of Serbia were in deep water, in a problem. The only one who appeared as a willing investor was a Chinese company. So what were we expected to do? To work to our own detriment. And we all know what my feeling is when it comes to European values, Western European values, and what have you. Do you know that today, the Danish government ratified an agreement on the construction of Northern Course 2 with Gazprom Neft, that is the Russian state, and British Petroleum has its stock there, is a shareholder. You said today that we entered the Euro-Asian Association. No, we didn't enter that. We didn't join it, as you said. We just signed a trade agreement, which will be in force until we do join the European Union, after which it will not be in force anymore, because this is of importance for our citizens, because it opens up possibilities for our companies. Whether we will be able to indeed place our goods on their market, we don't know. The United States of America are an increasing partner. The huge company, Writing company, has started working here and has already constructed a huge information park. So with it, Serbia is the 4th in Europe and the 10th in the world with the number of digital workers in its workforce. So what are we doing? We are trying to keep them here rather than send them or have them go to other countries and destinations and work for higher salaries. What do we need? We need more companies, more U.S. companies that will be striving to attract. And when we do join the European Union, we hope soon, Serbia will be an economically strong country. It will not depend so much on donations, as is the case with some countries which are now members of the European Union, which are still being liberally helped and enter the European Union much quicker than Serbia. Thank you. Mr. Bogovic has the floor for his comment. I did not want to speak on this particular item, but I do feel that I should say a few words. I don't think we are going in the right direction. We came here not, as the colleague said, sitting behind me, you don't want us. No, we came here to talk about the state of play, the situation in Serbia and elsewhere here. Because whether we admit it or not, things need to be changed, altered, improved. A country which wants to be prepared for the serious race to the European Union has to improve its rule of law, etc., etc. On the other hand, we have to comprehend the fact that there have been some changes that have taken place in the European Union, and we are talking about integration in this year 2019. I will be speaking on specific points and I will go into more length, but when I heard this parody in respect of the European Union and the parody in respect of what is your opposition and you will not be entering the European Union because so many of your young people are already there. No, the trend is, the desire is to stop the trend of rural to urban migration and also to more developed regions within the European Union. So when I saw these figures, about 101,000 deaths, less than 40,000 births, and so 30,000 people or so leaving the country. This is not a reason or time for parody. I do believe that the European Union is the place where you will find ways for arresting these undesirable trends. Politicians can talk about this, but what I came here for is to work on the enlargement because I believe that to be good for both the European Union and the people who live in Serbia. Thank you, Mr. Bogovic. You are quite right. Irrespective of our style of speech, that is a topical question, one of the top 10 questions, and the state is addressing it seriously. Item 3 is the next assessment of progress in negotiations. Chapters 23 and 24 is the next on our agenda. The rapporteur, Mr. Daly. Thank you, Co-Chairman.
Looking at the past 1.5 to 2 hours that we have spent in the room, I wouldn't repeat some commonalities, general points, but just to reset our discussion, our debate. When in 2014 I ended up in the European Parliament when I was elected, the topic then was there will be no enlargement in the next mandate of the European Parliament. That's what President Juncker said, and we remember that, all of us. In 2017, there was a change, and the Commission took the lead in this enlargement discourse, and the Minister here present, the Commission strategy from 2018, February, enlargement strategy. Last year, we followed Bulgarian and Romanian presidency of the Union, and we could see, thanks to first Bulgarian efforts, there was a genuine, real attempt to bring back the enlargement in the focus. And there were some nice pictures taken, some nice declaration signed. And I believe that in this respect, 2018 for me was a sign that things would move in the good direction. However, 2018 arrived, we have the new parliament. We are the first new composition of this committee. So 2014, we've heard from the Commission that there will be no enlargement. Now we have the same message from the European Council. I think it's unjust to attack the whole Council because it's only France, Denmark, and Holland that are opposing enlargement. We all fully know that most of the member states, especially new member states, so-called new member states, they're called new member states in spite of 10 years passing since they've joined. We now see a decision by the Council which really annulled, made void the credibility of the Union, sadly, not only in the events of Northern Macedonia and Albania, but regarding the whole region of the Western Balkans. And in a way, of course, us in the Parliament, we are parliamentarians here, all MEPs, and I believe my colleagues, us here, here in Belgrade, we are really the most committed to keeping the topic of enlargement on the agenda, to keep this whole enlargement business alive. But it will be so difficult to regain the confidence, to recreate the confidence between the European institutions and the countries of the Western Balkans region. The next test will be the December meeting of the Council, when we have the decisions to be made regarding opening chapters with Serbia and Montenegro. And of course, there is the issue of the new European Commission, which should take office within weeks, sooner the better. In this respect, I think that it is very difficult to ask questions and to present conditions and to condition the candidate states, you know. We have the case of Northern Macedonia and Albania, which, according to all criteria that European Commission set forth, they've done their homework, they've fulfilled all the criteria, and then in the end, the Union, namely the Council of the Union, at the end of the day, did not give them the green light. So now we have this cloud above all of us, how to move on and how to get out of this corner we are in. So with some both trepidation and optimism and mixed feelings, I'm looking towards December, the summit, and what will happen with the chapters. Will they be opened or not? But to go back to 23 and 24, we all know that these chapters are the key chapters. And the fact that these two chapters are actually the framework for the whole negotiating process. This was the new thing introduced for Serbia, which was not the case with previous accessions to the Union. So instead of big political topics, I would land and go back to reality, say a couple of things, practical things, how Union can help in respect of 23 and 24 and how Serbia can make progress there. Judiciary and also minority rights, which is a subject dear to my heart. When we talk courts of law, the judiciary, we have to build the capacities, admin capacities, IT capacities in the courts and prosecution. We've heard in the reports previous years that there is what we call the backlog in English of court cases. And another issue there, another problem is the very long the duration of the court cases, exceptional length of court cases, which is another deterring factor for the citizens to seek justice in courts of law. So building capacities of the judiciary, and especially the stability of the project, financing stability of the capacity building projects could help to make progress there. And I think the Union should step up its efforts through financing these efforts to provide capacities in Serbian judiciary. Finances should be stepped up for this reform, because if the judiciary gets strengthened up, if the court cases take less time, this will be better for the citizens, for the investors. Everybody will be able then to see the rule of law in action. So it will not be just the talk about the principles which are sort of heavenly, remote thing, but what it means in real life. So I think European Union can help more, can help stronger when it comes to financing this. Second thing is the issue of minority rights. What is clear, I've said this many times, Serbia has outstanding legislation. The system is really well set up, defined in the law. Even when you compare Serbian legislation with some member states in the Union, standards in the Serbian legislation are higher than in many member states. What is important, and it was very important for me, and we also said this in the Parliament and in our resolutions, it was extremely important that Serbia, on Serbia's own initiative, did come up with a special action plan for the protection of minorities. And I also think that after several years now that the action plan is implemented, and also bearing in mind that the councils of the minorities, national councils of the minorities are newly elected, we have the new composition, and legal framework is in place thanks to the action plan sorted out. So I think because there is much more legitimacy is stronger, and I think the time is now right to look at other issues, other problems, like the proportionate presence of minorities in public administration or the education or information of the public of the minorities. I am, of course, fully aware of the fact that Serbia has a large number and huge diversity of minorities, minority communities, at different levels of the social, cultural, political infrastructure. And of course, everybody's looking in its own interest, and everybody's asking, demanding to have so-called tailor-made solutions. But I also think that the Union should help here, help Serbia to additionally support, to provide support, because the results that Serbia achieves in this field can be presented Europe-wide as a blueprint that even some member states can follow. So I think these efforts that Serbia is implementing in the domain of minority rights deserve much more substantial support, financial support from the Union. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Dele. I would take this opportunity to draw your attention to the fact that we are finishing in some 40 minutes, the latest. We have another point, so I would like us to take care of the time management. Mr. Rističević, I hope you are agreeing. You agree not to take the floor twice. Mr. Đurić, you want just something to say at the very end? Both. All right. Mrs. Kovač, please. Thank you. One of the opposition representative complained that he had to wait 1.5 hours. But also the majority, as you can see, I waited a long time and I have to speak brief. But I take this opportunity to greet everybody, guests, colleagues. But our guests are our friends, and they fought for many years for the enlargement in the Western Balkans. They are long years friends from Serbia. I would like to thank Mr. Bogovic for everything that he said just a moment ago. And I'm really happy that Her Excellency the Minister is still here. It is not easy to talk about 23-24. A lot was said from the beginning. I would not repeat what was said. We all know it all. Our negotiations are going ahead, and we are in the limelight, we are scrutinized, and if we slide back in these two areas, then no progress. As a minority representative, I have to stress it. We heard words inclusion, transparency several times today, and I think it is the most important thing. All institutions need to be inclusive and transparent. And when we have a wider insight, when we look broader, that's what the topics are actually talking about. That's what that's what the chapters are about. That's what the chapters are talking to us about. And I was thinking, when did we meet last time? 10th meeting was in Strasbourg. It was so brief because the elections were underway. We met in March. It was hardly a day. So I was looking what was adopted since the last year, the laws that we started implementing recently. But the most recent thing is here, finally Serbia accomplished the revision of the 2 action plans for chapters 23-24. It took the whole year practically, and the most recent thing is that we have the comments of the European Commissions sent back to us on the 22nd of October, just a few days ago, concerning these 2 revised action plans. Chapter 23, the negotiation team already held a meeting. We looked at the comments on the first draft for the revised action plan for Chapter 23. What is interesting, when we adopted these action plans at the very beginning of the negotiation process, we were very upbeat, we were very enthusiastic. And the time frame then was based on some different timetable. We looked at different time horizons, but now we are aware, we feel it, this process is not a fast one, it's a slow process, long drawn-out process. I wouldn't comment the comments. We are fully aware of what needs changed and improved in 2024, what are the expectations from Serbia. But from the point of view of the Assembly, not just this committee, but European Integrations Committee, I have to stress one thing which is unclear. We will work on it. The comment says the National Assembly should be more involved to make it possible, for instance, for the convent to take place in the Assembly. Not enough members take place, only the EU Select Committee are present. We will do our best to have the whole EU Select Committee present in future with the meetings, during the meetings with the convent. Also, the media criticized us regarding the Greco recommendations, which is Chapter 24, and recently we heard that Greco came to conclusions that the overall level of harmonization cannot be considered as globally unsatisfactory. It's not globally unsatisfactory anymore, so I think this is a positive conclusion by Greco. And another thing which I would like to stress is that we have the law finally adopted on free legal aid, beginning of November last year. We started implementing it on the 1st of October, which I think is a great thing. We waited for this law a very long time, and we are now training those who offer free legal aid, and the cooperation is even more intensive now with the NGOs, with the NGOs who have years of experience in providing legal aid to people. Also, we have the law on lobbying adopted end of last year, and this May we have the law on prevention of corruption. So that's from 24. Then migrations, we have the strategy for the fight of irregular migrations in Serbia 2018-2020, together with the action plan, and part of this strategy is the answer to the interim measure of the EU for the development of human resources in the domain of irregular migrations, which is a very crucial importance. Somebody mentioned also the reform of public administration. A few days ago, we started drafting the strategy for the public administration reform, 23rd of October, and it will be the strategy for 2021 till 2030, the continuation of the current modernization of public administration. We set up the National Academy for Public Administration, And what Mr. Daly just mentioned, minority rights. Mr. Daly said that the legal framework is good, but you can always make it better. Last year was very fruitful for the laws dealing with minorities. We amended two umbrella laws, the law on national councils of the minorities and the law on the protection of freedoms and rights of the minorities. And in the same package, we had the laws on the official use of language and script and the law on birth records, civil records, and also, according to the Constitution, the minority members can declare their minority affiliation, but it is to be entered in the civil registry also, the birth certificate, birth registry, that's a registry. And also, but for our friends, you're aware, you follow Serbia for a long time, but when we talk about the media and reporting, minority languages, Vojvodina Television is generating program in 16 languages, Serbian and 15 minority languages. Official use of languages, Vojvodina is special, but out of 45 local authorities, in 39 out of 45, besides Serbian language and Cyrillic script, in official use you have at least one more language. In many municipalities you have several official languages of the minorities. Thank you very much. I try to be very brief and to respect my few minutes. Yes, indeed, Mrs. Kovac, Mr. Đurić, very brief, please. Very, very brief, since we are late. Chapter 23, no need to elaborate the examples, what is wrong, what can be better. The coalition of NGOs before the contract, so-called preugovor, in September, they published their annual survey. Survey is called Alarm, and in more than 80 pages, they listed all the things that are problematic political criteria regarding 24. A few examples. The trustee for the protection of individual data, appointment 7 months late. REM Council, incomplete for years. Deputies of the Ombudsman were not appointed, and so on and so forth. So, from our point of view, we understand, we know that Chapter 23 is fundamental. It should provide the answer to the question, does this society wish to have a democratic system which will be functioning regardless of personal solutions and regardless who is in government? Or we want to have a state which we will appropriate, capture as ours when we snatch it from the political opponents, from the hands of political opponents. So the question is, does the Serbian society wish democracy or not? Of course, we will always look at whoever's in government and scrutinize their views and whether they respect their electoral promises. Thank you. And Mr. Jovanovic?
I will be brief also. Firstly, allow me to thank Mr. Daly for the really brief address. He indicated certain issues that should have an affirmative dimension of thinking within the EU. So, dear colleagues from the European Parliament, please pay attention to the following facts. Firstly, it is true that it is necessary for the judiciary of Serbia to be provided with additional financial support. It is true that the European Union has done a lot up till now through GIS, which is the foundation dealing with international cooperation and assistance. A lot has been done for the courts in Serbia through various projects. This is to be commended. The European Union is very positive and fair in that respect. But on the other hand, there is something that you should recognize much more than it is the case now. When it comes to critiques when it comes to the length of the process, when it comes to the lengthy procedures and proceedings, well, we have some cases that is related to Kosovo. We have some court proceedings that last for 22 years, like a case of bankruptcy that cannot be brought to conclusion because our judicial authorities do not have access to Pristina, to the provisional institutions there, because according to the law, they need to carry out certain activities and also according to the constitution. So we will not be able to solve this problem. We will have this mortgage of lengthy proceedings until certain problems are solved. And this problem, which I indicate, is a fact, undoubtable. On the other hand, dear Ms. Fayon, you should know that these authorities, and I will take the liberty of saying, since my profession is closely related to the judiciary, as attorney, I take the liberty of saying we have done a lot. One of the things that has radically changed the situation when it comes to cases that last long is the program for solving the backlog. And this program has been adopted by the High Judicial Council. And based on this program, many cases are now being solved, and they are no longer old cases. We now have a very few cases that are treated or categorized in that regard, that respect. It is a fact that Serbia as a state has to increase the salaries, the earnings of holders of judicial functions in order to prevent corruptive acts and to prevent the possibility of corruptive acts. And you need to assist us much more than up till now. That is to avoid unargumented criticism when it comes to political interference into the judiciary. Such critiques are not founded on facts. Certain financial lobbies are now exerted influence on the judiciary, and we are afraid of them more than of alleged political influence. More recently, frankly, they do not exist to the extent to which it is stated. Thank you. And nobody asked for the floor to comment this point. Now, item 4. Electoral framework and processes, state of play, and future steps. Mr. Bogojevic, thank you. I know that our time is now made shorter. I will try to be fast in the keynote presentation. Firstly, we are here because we know that you will have your elections in springtime, so we came earlier, just like you came to the European Parliament in springtime. That was felt in Strasbourg, and that is felt now, that the elections are forthcoming, but these are serious matters. It is very important that these will be regular elections, which was not the case in the past. That is a reflection of a political culture. And it is important, even though some people see it as a problem that 4 years have already passed. We know what objections arose when it comes to the elections in the past, financing of the campaigns, access to the media, and because of that and some other reasons, these boycotts are happening. What was mentioned today, that is not the method which the European Union would accept, but is happening ever more frequently as a method in the Balkans, which brings to the term of Europeanization of Balkan, or Balkanization of Europe. I hope that the first will prevail. And this is the attempt of the Parliament and your NGOs that did the job. Well, this mediation that is now introduced is important because we need to build confidence, because if there is no confidence before the elections, it will be very difficult to work after the elections. I don't know what the situation would be in case this boycott will continue. The format which our colleague McAllister proposed for Mr. Kukan and Frankenstein and will be a team that will be augmented by the head of the delegation and the rapporteur. So hopefully on these two occasions of their presence, the dialogue will start and followed up in the parliament and later on during the elections. When I listen and hear what the expectations from the boycott are, I can say, like I said earlier, that is not the method that is acceptable in the European Union, even though some expect that based on the boycott, the European Union will arrive here after the elections and say, well, the elections were not legitimate. Now is the right time for all of us to wake up, to have this cross-dialogue, and to create the conditions for the elections to be legitimate. We know that this is a sensitive matter. When you come too frequently, they see you as pro-government or pro-opposition, but the European Parliament does not intend to take any sides. We want to be a mediator. Mediation is required, and the goal is to improve the election conditions, to make them fair, because without fair elections, there can be no democracy. But after the elections, one cannot expect that somebody will come after the elections, somebody from Europe, and say the elections were this or that. Hopefully we will find the solutions now in the coming 2 or 3 months so that the elections can be legitimate. Mr. Shormas, distinguished colleagues, Ms. Fayyam, I'm happy that you are going to become a part of this process after what we have heard today, as well as all others from the European Parliament who are welcome here. I have been in the politics for 30 years and I have been an MP for 20 years, since December 2000. It will be 20 years. I believe that the conditions, the election conditions, have never been better for holding the parliamentary elections in Serbia, with better possibilities for political actors to introduce themselves, to present themselves to the citizens and to be elected. It doesn't mean that I am right, but somebody who actively participated in electoral victories, in removing the regime of Milosevic, like colleague Marian Rističević and some others here, we won the elections. And because the election results were not recognized, the 5th October happened. Now, as a person who belongs to the right-center wing, I am not much of a supporter of revolutions and violence in the streets in order to solve problems. Precisely institutionally, through elections, things should be done. Now, let me tell you, and I know that you know people, and we are talking about only one group within the opposition, which is called the Alliance for Serbia. If they would appear in the public broadcaster RTS for 24 hours, around the clock, still they will not appear at the elections. That is my opinion. I don't know if that is the opinion of the party from which I come, but my opinion is that they don't want to appear at the elections. They don't want to turn out. They want to be non-institutional party, hoping that there will be some agreement between Belgrade and Pristina next year, and in order to be able to try to cause some unrest, to accuse us of who know what, and to create non-institutionally problems in Serbia, because through the elections they cannot come to power. The citizens of Serbia know them. 10% of votes for them is something only to be imagined. Public officials' campaign is an objection, but because you are MEPs, let me mention an example, a brutal example of such a campaign in Serbia. The elections in 2008, The last week of the elections, the last week, before the elections, yes, the Democratic Party and the then Prime Minister, it was a technical government, and Vojislav Koštunica refused to sign the SAA because he had the technical term of office. The Deputy Prime Minister from the Democratic Party does sign it, and the European Union assists and helps the Democratic Party during the elections then. A day later, Fiat, as the major investor, comes as an Italian investor to Kragujevac. The head of state appears on the screens, and their rating goes up 60%, and the rating of Serbian Radical Party, of their political opponents, Democratic Party of Serbia, goes down. So they take over the authority in Serbia. If you can just understand what I'm saying, who participated, Serbia experienced that. But now, President Vučić appears often in the media. We used to have a president who appeared once in 5 days, but they have a problem because President Vučić has 5 activities a day, and the media carry that. He keeps working. He is a very active president. In your countries, the activities of prime ministers and presidents are shown on screens. So if he meets with European officials on a daily basis, that is a problem for them. They don't know how to cope with his energy and with what Serbia is doing, as how it is changing. In conclusion, let me say, we are willing and ready to talk. We have already changed a few things. We have made some things tougher. The government conclusions has now increased the penalties for the officials' campaign. It used to be applied up till now based on their law on elections, so there were misdemeanor penalties for those who violate the campaign, but now the government cautioned everybody in the public sector that the law on labor relations will be applied if they violate the public officials' campaign, which is a responsibility more for those who do that. Talking to you, I believe that the Serbian Progressive Party will do everything possible in order to make the organization of the elections the best possible and to create the best possible conditions. Regardless of that, I'm telling you now, because you will participate in the negotiations, they will not take part in the elections. They will not. No matter what conditions you create. If you create the conditions like in Slovenia, for instance, still they will not turn out for the reasons which I mentioned. Thank you.
Mr. Đurić, once again, thank you. Well, the Party of Modern Serbia is among those opposition organizations which have not decided to boycott the elections. We actually also stopped boycotting Parliament. We're participating in its work. We also announced and keep repeating in public that as regards the decision of whether to participate in the elections or boycott them, we shall take that decision once they are called. We believe by the premature announcement of boycotts in advance thwarts all attempts to improve electoral conditions, and we believe that everything should be done through all possible formats of dialogue at all levels, in all institutions, wherever such dialogue is possible, for Serbia to actually acquire conditions for democratic and fair elections. It does not have such conditions right now, and such fair and democratic elections are something which is the most beneficial in terms of societal benefit. The Party of Modern Serbia and I personally, on behalf of my party, have been participating in all such dialogues at the Faculty of Political Sciences and in this parliamentary dialogue mediated by EP's representatives. First of all, now, I wish to offer my gratitude to the MEPs who participated in this election dialogue, because I believe that it is not proper to actually belittle their mediation in Serbian public by insisting on the designation that they're ex-MEPs, because Mr. Fleckenstein in his wheelchair and having painkillers injected in him, and this is something which really deserves respect. Him in that state, sitting with us, teaching us democracy, helping us learn democracy as a society which is under tutelage after so many years and has no conditions for fair and democratic elections. It is totally irrelevant what the European representatives hear from the authorities in Serbia, their interpretation of the electoral conditions in Serbia, where, as they say, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. It is the judgment of the third party which counts. There is an enormous societal group in Serbia which believes that there are no conditions in Serbia for free and democratic elections. According to CRTA, the NGO, which is a participant in this parliamentary and pre-election dialogue, and as such is also, I suppose, acceptable to both the Serbian authorities and the European Party, the European Parliament, registered at a certain point the fact that two-thirds of Serbia's population thought that there were irregularities. Half of them thought that these irregularities affected the election result. So you have the evident mistrust of the citizens into the election procedure and the expedience, the purpose, use of voting. So, as far as we are concerned, we shall participate in all formats of dialogue, in all institutions up to the very last moment, and we shall render our contribution to those. There are some other things that I wish to say here, because this is the first time that we are actually debating in front of our citizens, because this is being transmitted. We say that according to Chatham House the rules, this is done in this way or that. But first of all, I wish to say that the role of the NGO sector is not perceived correctly in our public. It is the perception that we are being forced to do something by some person named Soros at the dictate of the European Union. This is a banal interpretation of the role of some NGOs, such as the Fund for Open Society. These are organizations which technically deal with the subject matter of elections. These are people who are technically competent to establish problems, to propose solutions, the creation of specific policies to deal with these problems. But it is up to politicians to actually debate, consider their technical solutions, dismiss them, reject them, or whatever. So this is not about a dictate of some center powers, conspiratorial centers of power imposing some solutions on us. And another misconception, we are not talking about a simple respect of existing laws. That goes without saying. And, of course, the respect for election laws is inconsistent and not good enough. But the public should also know that we are talking about amendments to numerous legislation which defines the election ecosystem. One of these laws that we, as the Party of Modern Serbia, deal with more than with others is the problem of financing political activities. We believe that we should reverse the 2014 change when it was allowed that money which was intended for the regular work of political parties to be used also for campaigns. This is something which is not in keeping with the OSCE recommendations. This is at least what I read, because all participants should have an equal playing field for this particular competition or game. And for adequate results to be achieved, I should ask this question: who will be meritorious and authoritative enough for all interested stakeholders to say the election conditions in Serbia are okay? It will not suffice for any political figure to say so on television or tweet something to that effect. It will have to be at least the OSCE or ODIHR to say that. Because I don't think it will be enough even for the European Parliament to say so, because many competent people, highly educated people have told me actually the mediators of the European Parliament actually suit the ruling majority. Practically, it was this government that chose who will be in charge of this dialogue on behalf of the European Parliament. Of course, this is a ridiculous argument, and I know that the Serbian authorities have no way of doing that in European institutions, but this is the public perception which I wish to transmit to you, and that public will have to vote, and we have to respond to such perceptions. Thank you. Mr. Đurić, let us be precise. These unacceptable comments in respect of the EPs, people who participate, do not come from you or from us, but from those who advocate a boycott. They come from citizens. What citizens? Citizens of Serbia. Citizens of Serbia who are not members of any political organization. I am simply an MP who communicates more than others through social networks with the citizens. No, let us be precise. We are talking about those who advocate the boycott. Those people have an unacceptable attitude towards them. Let us be precise. It is those who, this is what you will say. This is, thank you. Mr. Orlic, Madam Fayon, distinguished colleagues, MPs, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, today we are discussing for some hours this agenda. Now we're talking about the electoral framework and processes as the fourth item on our agenda, which is a good opportunity for us to scan the topical situation. Initially, let me say that it is very important for dialogue. That dialogue does exist now in Serbia, that we need to continue talking and improve the election conditions in Serbia. As someone from the Serbian Progressive Party, the largest party, I can say that this party has shown a good will, good political will as well, and we have demonstrated that we have the necessary willingness to accommodate the numerous requests of both civil society organizations and partners on the other side. The opposition, which has decided to participate in a number of rounds of talks about the change of election conditions. I agree with colleague Shormas that today these conditions are much better than they used to be in 2008 or 2012. It is very good for us to continue with this dialogue, to keep it up. And as someone who has a degree in political sciences, I regret the fact that we have to have mediation, external mediation, to help us actually conduct this political dialogue. It would have been better had it occurred to us ourselves to actually start conducting such a dialogue, that is to say the authorities and the opposition, to talk about changing election conditions. This is a sort of a test in a way for us to show how much we have progressed today and are willing today to work more than was the case in 2009 and to introduce changes. I followed all the talks in the Assembly. I agree with Mr. Orlic that it is the National Assembly which is the place for political proposals, not the street, not violent ways, not the burning of books, and not the demonstration of violence at every step in Belgrade and other cities of Serbia. During these talks at the Faculty of Political Sciences, as well as in the National Assembly, the meeting of 9th and 10th October this year, we had a number of constructive proposals, so some of which have already been implemented, so that I do not agree with the previous speaker from the opposition, Mr. Đurić, who said that there are no conditions for fair elections in Serbia and that we have done nothing in this previous period. He perhaps did not listen attentively enough or does not know what measures the working group of the government of Serbia, led by Mr. Nebojša Stefanović, already has done and implemented in respect of election conditions in Serbia. I repeat, political dialogue is always important. Perhaps it does happen sometimes that we hear things which we are displeased with, do not like, but for the sake of a good debate, it is irrelevant whether a good proposal comes from the opposition which is participating or from the ruling party. What matters is whether this proposal is good and leads to changes in society. At this 11th meeting today of the SAPC, I wish to say that the conditions today are indeed better than they used to be. They are not ideal, but they are better. Mr. Šormaz informed you of the situation in 2019. I wish to say what the conditions were like in 2012, when there was a substantive change of the government in Serbia, what kind of footage we had on the public broadcaster in respect of Tomislav Nikolic during the presidential elections. This is a glaring example of how bad the conditions were then in our countries. For us in the Progressive Party, we wish to say that it is important to continue this dialogue, that we should talk together to see how we can go about improving matters. Dialogue is the proper approach, and I always choose dialogue over destruction, over intimidation, burning books in the center of Belgrade, violence, etc. I attended this promotion of the book of the deputy mayor of Belgrade. This is a book about Belgrade. This happened in the evening when in the Sava Center and in the National Assembly there was a conference of Interparliamentary Union, over 2,000 interparliamentary members in Serbia from 140 countries of the world. We wanted to show them a better picture of Belgrade, whereas the opposition showed them the worst picture of Belgrade. And this was received wide coverage in all the media and on television. Also, it is a bit strange, but and I fail to understand really the representatives of the opposition, especially those from the previous regime, when they say that it used to be super and now it's no good at all. Are we talking about double standards or double morality? It just doesn't hold water, if you ask me. If they did not change the conditions then, if they were good in 2008 and 2012, and how come, and no laws were changed, how come that they are not good now? Because the laws are still the same. There is something amiss there. Also, I have in front of me a document which is the summary of the conclusions of the first inter-party dialogue in the National Assembly on improving conditions for elections. And I wish to inform colleague Đurić what were the first measures that have already been taken to improve these conditions. Prohibition of state officials to use public resources during the campaign and sanctions for such abuse, measures by which public administration, Ministry of Public Administration and local self-government has to monitor the electoral rolls. people designated to work on the internet page to inform citizens. So the recommendations of the Election Commission for the necessary training and preparation for the conducting of election, the public inspection of audit of the work and the records from elections, also the national, international observers, access to the electoral roll. So, in other words, all citizens shall be able or have access to the voters' registers after the elections to see whether someone voted in their place or not. The Speaker of the Assembly, Madam Maja Gojković, called upon all the groups in Parliament in March this year to conduct dialogue. The government set up a working group to cooperate with the OSCE and ODIHR, also in respect of the elections, and this working group is cooperating with all relevant institutions. And for all our colleagues, MEPs, let me just briefly say that with ODIHR, Serbia really has good cooperation. The procedure is such that OSCE, the host country has to send an official invitation to OSCE and ODIHR, and it was already done. In September, Mr. Stefanovic, the Minister of the Interior, sent an official letter through the OSCE mission in Serbia, which was then conveyed to the Warsaw office of ODIHR. So this letter has been sent. We also have very good cooperation with the OSCE mission in Serbia, with all institutions of the Republic of Serbia. These are three forms of good cooperation. The OSCE mission was set up on the 11th of January 2011 at the invitation of the then Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, and it covers not only topics having to do with the reform of election processes, but the strengthening of democratic institutions in Serbia, cooperation with the media, the rule of law, the development and promotion of human rights, and many other topics. Also, our public and our citizens are most familiar of the cooperation through observer missions, which ODIHR is dispatching through its Warsaw office. Serbia is actively participating in the action of support to elections in Western Balkans, which also focuses on improving electoral conditions in Serbia, which is also overseen by the ODIHR office in Warsaw. In the parliamentary, we had them observing parliamentary elections and also presidential elections that was observed by the chief of the mission and 5 experts. So that Serbia has a very good cooperation with the OSCE. As a member of the parliamentary delegation in the OSCE Assembly, I can say that we should continue with such cooperation in the time ahead of us. That goes for MPs as well as for all institutions in our country. In my last sentence, we have demonstrated that the authorities of this country are more than willing to make a step forward and to improve the election conditions in our country. The political will exists, as we have also demonstrated. My personal impression that the atmosphere is much better now than it used to be in 2008 and 2012. Thank you, Mr. Stojmirovic. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, from this short overview, we have actually understood that our election law is not really the most ideal and that we are ready to change it, to amend it. It was not brought by today's majority, but according to that law, it managed to win and to gain power. So I have been less in politics than my colleague Shormas. He is my senior in that particular respect. But I do remember the first days of the early 90s when we embarked on a multi-party system in Serbia. We had a majority system at that time, and the socialists were extremely strong, and they managed to win over two-thirds of the votes. We, in the opposition, advocated a change of the electoral system. We wanted a proportional system. And then, after a specific period of time, we managed to get some proportionate system with 46 constituencies, etc. It was reduced, and ultimately we had a proportionate system in which Serbia is one electoral unit, and it is still the valid system. But what is the problem of our opposition? The problem of our opposition lies in the fact that it wants such a system of elections in which it would win. This is a perpetuum mobile. Colleagues who have technical degrees know what I'm talking about. This is impossible. We all have to understand that every war ends in a peace treaty, every quarrel, every argument also ends in some sort of an agreement, and we have to act like that. We have to adopt this attitude. The only way to solve this in a cultured, civilized way is talking and agreeing. Agreement, but unfortunately we have people who reject this, but this is only something which will be not beneficial to them. Thank you, Mr. Mijatovic. Ladies and gentlemen, lots of things have been said here. I'm not going to repeat anything, but I wish to state a few things.
We speak about the dialogue, and there is dialogue in Serbia. Some taking place in informal places, like at the Faculty of Political Science, and we have dialogue in proper environment in the Assembly, which took place, parties which are elected parties in the Parliament, and some which are non-parliamentary ones took place. The dialogue brought a relaxation in the political life, at least for those who want to see it. Why do I say that? The NGOs and those expert organizations like Transparency, CESID and CERTA provided their proposals. The government accepted almost 60% of what they proposed. We heard about public officials' campaign, abuse of public resources, financing of political parties, unified comprehensive electoral list, which is now electronic, digital. Many inherited irregularities are now removed from the electoral list. So the framework is prepared. The government even proposed several amendments to the law. The Assembly would consider that. Most comments were regarding REM, the regulatory body. 3 members are missing. We'll provide 3 members, no problem. As the member of Social Democratic Party and a participant in the negotiations, we are ready to adopt everything which is realistic at a given moment. And just to end up by saying one sentence, Serbia is a serious state, and we will have elections in spring 2020. We have to send this message simply because Serbia is a stable state, and we will have our electoral processes when they're due to happen. Mr. Rističević. Ladies and gentlemen, members of Parliament, law and justice are 2 different things. We often speak about politics applying pressure on judiciary. Here we have the pressure of judiciary on politics. We have independent judiciary, but they're not divinely independent. They're not independent from the law. If we comment, for instance, when we have the Court of Appeal who let free a pedophile who raped a 13-year-old girl with the judicial explanation that it is okay because it was the Roma population. I will bring you, if you don't believe me, I will bring you what the press wrote about it. And then you had the salvo of different judicial organizations who are very politically active. So the judges are taking part in political organizations. The judges are taking to order the laws in advance, you know, and they're criticizing the MPs. I don't mind being criticized. And when they say somebody set free 11 individuals who killed 80 people, which Supreme Court of Cassation said it was the breach of the law by the judiciary, then if you commend this, then they call you a tyrant. They call you somebody who is unduly influencing the judiciary. I think we have the opposite situation. Milosevic did not win 2/3 of the votes, but Milosevic had half of the votes, and because of the majority electoral system, he won considerably over the disunited opposition. He had 3/4 or 4/5 of the MPs. As somebody who fought against the Milosevic, this law is the result of fighting against Milosevic. We adopted this electoral law only 2 months after Milosevic was brought down. So this belongs to the former power. You know, I was part of them then. I was at the side of Democratic Party, but we were rebellious. And we fought for the electoral results to be recognized. We wanted them to be recognized. We wanted extraordinary elections, snap elections. Now we hear the demands for the elections to be postponed. They want to have the government before the elections. You know, I was against the European Parliament meddling in our home affairs. Not because of the Parliament, European Parliament, but because our opposition thinks that somebody from abroad should give them power. You know, you cannot import democracy in a foreign trade. Democracy has to be nurtured at home. And as far as the media is concerned, you know, we did not meddle in the elections. MEPs can say that. We didn't interfere in the European elections, you know, from here. Would they boycott the elections in Europe under the conditions that European legislation adopted? We didn't adopt these laws. Election of the MPs, President of Serbia, financing of the parties. All these laws our party inherited from before. So we are going to the elections under their conditions. They cannot come to the elections under their own conditions. But you know, biggest electoral thefts are taking place after the elections. I said one should not be able to buy the debts of a political party. So somebody who has money can actually buy the party. And we had people buying 2 or 3 parties buying their debts. And we also said when the deputy in the assembly changes parties and joins party who never took part in the elections, he should be not only thrown out, but he should provide 15,000 signatories because he transferred the electoral will of the 15,000 people. You know, this is called the post-electoral theft. You take your 15,000 votes and you transfer it to a party who didn't take part in the elections, which is the distortion of the electoral will. And then you have the parties of the national minorities, which are blossoming like mushrooms after it. We want them registered, the lady knows it. We want the electoral list of minorities, and the founders of the minority parties should be on the minority electoral list. And also these foreign televisions, allegedly European Union ordered them to broadcast here. We want these foreign televisions and foreign media not to be able to broadcast in Serbia because this is direct foreign involvement in Serbia during the elections. We don't mix and meddle in elections abroad. We don't want foreigners to mix and meddle in our elections. And to conclude, we have the gentleman from modern Serbia who says that the elections are not fair. His leader, while he was still with the leader, Saša Radulović, who first had an NGO, but all right, he turned it into a party. His leader said that the elections were fair and that Vučić won fairly. That's what his former leader said. And having European values, and his leader said that European Union is a globalistic and banking evil. So I welcome his political change. But this party in 2016 did not take part in the elections, but the votes from Saša Radulović were transferred to a new party which did not exist in 2016. I call this post-electoral theft. Or, for instance, Mrs. Marinika Tepić, who was at the list of autonomous party in Vojvodina. Isn't it so, madam? She transferred her votes to a party which didn't exist and which is Mr. Gilas's party now. This is inadmissible for me. But if you have 15,000 new signatories, then it is legitimate, because then you can change your party. Thank you very much. Mr. Mitchell, 2 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair, Co-Chair, Mrs. Minister, Mrs. Fajon, colleagues. Just a couple of words about the electoral conditions. I have to break this mantra that we hear from the opposition all the time, that my colleagues repeated also, which is one of the reasons for the boycott. There are no conditions for fair elections because we had irregularities in previous elections. I'm a party operative since 2011, and during every election I offer legal support to our members in the electoral committee, and I control the elections in Novi Sad. And I will tell you briefly, I think it's similar in all countries, but I have to give you the procedure briefly, and I'll tell you why I'm saying all this. How the whole electoral process is happening. We have polling places and we have polling committees made up of opposition and government representatives. Once the polling day ends, they countersigned a memo together entering eventual irregularities. This memo, together with all the ballot papers, is put in a bag. Bag is sealed, and 3 members of the committee, 1 from the opposition always, take this to the State Electoral Commission. In the Electoral Commission, you have republics that again you have opposition representatives, and they look into the irregularities that came with the ballot papers. So during the elections of 2016, it's 8,360-something polling stations in Serbia. Do you know how many remarks, complaints there were altogether? 60. Which is less than 1%. 15 were adopted, and 15 polling stations had elections repeated. You could enter your comments everywhere, and only 60 polling stations complained. And you know, I got these figures from the report of CRTA, which is an NGO and is not very much in favor of us, the ruling party. So they say 99% of polling places had electoral process according to the law. So this is an opposition mantra and a lame excuse for them not to go to the elections because the citizens will not give them votes. Thank you very much. Very briefly. Of course, there are no problems during the polling day. The memos that come with the ballot papers are the irregularities during the polling day, the voting day. We are talking about regularities about next year elections, which are happening today, a year ahead of the elections. You know, if you say there are no problems, then we can say, why are we bothering European colleagues to come here and mediate? Obviously, European Parliament colleagues understood that our electoral process has some problems. Since the man in his wheelchair was brought to Belgrade with painkillers to take part in our electoral process, of course, he didn't come to Belgrade because he agrees with my colleague that there are no electoral problems in Belgrade. There are, and these problems are happening today for the elections from next year. 3 minutes to 7. The Secretariat told us that because of the translation, we should finish within 3 minutes. Mrs. Joksimovic wanted a comment. Thank you, Chair. I thought it would be good to stay till the end and listen to everybody, because often we hear critics that executives are not here, but the Parliament is here. You know, it's all right. Parliament is our host. I was an MP. I know what it looks like, but I have to point out a few things, few falsehoods that were said from the beginning. I monitored very precisely, and I know who said what. Deputy Juric said something which is not only untrue, which shows your misunderstanding of the process. And you plead to deal with European integrations. You should learn about this process. It's in the interest of this assembly. There are no technical chapters. All chapters are essential, and all chapters are reform ones. There are technically prepared chapters. No chapter like 27 or 11 agriculture or 12 phytosanitary controls. They have huge reform potential. And if they're not negotiated in the right way, and these are the chapters where we do negotiate, the rest is the transposition of the acquis. You negotiate the transition periods of the implementation when you want to protect certain categories in the economic system. Look at 11, agriculture policy. No chapter is negligible. They influence deeply all economic political processes in a state, and you can only negotiate the interim measures. The rest is not negotiating. You just decide the tempo of harmonizing, of adopting. The problem with 23-24, why they're suspensive, because this is not codified law. They are not the acquis. They are not the fruit of the general acquirement of the European Union. There is not one single model applied in judiciary or political systems or electoral systems. In Britain, they are leaving the Union now, but it is legitimate for the government to call for the elections when the government deems the moment for the election favorable for it. Legitimate are the systems with two-party systems. Legitimate are the systems with 2.5-party systems, but the question is of standards and procedures. Another thing that you said, Vučić said in Brussels that we find it favorable, something which is not full-time membership. I'm sorry if I didn't understand you well. Vučić said we are following what is happening. We are going to be Euro-pragmatic. We are not Euro-skeptic. We are not Euro-enthusiasts. You cannot be either at the moment. We are Euro-pragmatic. We are following what's happening, and we'll do whatever we can to stay part of this process, because our final goal is the full-time membership in the Union. Citizen support never lower since 2000. That's not true. In the last 3 polls, 6-month polls that we have, that we do as a ministry for years, using the Eurostat and Eurobarometer criteria, 58% until 5 or 6 years ago, it was between 40 and 47. So 3 times in a row we went over 50% of support, which I think is not the success only of this government, but the citizens understanding the process better and how important it is. And one more thing, you said contracts and preliminary contracts in 88 pages states a serious political platform of joining Serbia to the Union and not saying what it should do, namely the benchmarks by chapters. I wouldn't say who did it and why did it, so if you're quoting and citing, people do give us quotations from legitimate people and objective people not affiliated with political groups. Electoral conditions, you said you're MPs, but electoral process is not, or improving electoral conditions is not a process of favorizing the ruling party, but making conditions equal for all. Now we should defavorize the ruling party who comes across as a problem because people are voting for it. This will not take place because this is not democracy. Thank you all. Now we can adjourn. Mr. Ristici. Oh. Yes. You again let colleagues say about the public officials campaign. You know Zoran Živković, who was our prime minister, everybody forgot him. Live on state television, he was 24 hours and 3 minutes since 2016. Opposition representatives who are complaining that they are not present appeared 571 hours in the last 7 years on television. And the government has 548 hours. This is an NGO. I wouldn't call it an anti-government because the president of the NGO, whatever his name is, we found him, we got him when he was breaking the fence in front of the Serbian presidency when he tried to barge into the president's office. They're afraid of the elections. They want to win the power without elections. They want the foreign powers to bring them, put them into government, into power. He wants democracy to be imported to Serbia. For them, democracy is when you win the power by force, and this cannot be so. We cannot force people to watch Zoran Živković on television, but we have 2 foreign televisions here, non-registered here, on the SBB provider channel. They are opposition televisions, but you cannot make people watch those television to watch Vreme and Nin. We cannot force people to vote for the opposition, so we should kindly ask them probably to take power from us, and they would be only pleased then. Thank you for all these clarifications. Now I think we can adjourn our first day of work. We continue at 10 tomorrow morning, same place, Article 5.